Chapter 1. The Empty House. Katherine Adams stepped from the train at Oakwood, glanced expectantly up and down the station platform, hesitated a moment, and then, picking out a conspicuous spot under a glaring arc light, deposited her suitcase on the ground with a thump, mounted guard beside it and patiently waited for Nyoda to find her in the surging crowd. It was 2 days before Christmas, and travel was heavy. It seemed as though the entire population of Oakland was either coming home, departing, or rushing madly up and down before the panting train in search of friends and relatives. Katherine was engulfed in a tidal wave of rapturous greetings that rolled over her from every side, as a coach full of soldiers, home for Christmas, were met and surrounded by the waiting lines of townspeople. Katherine stood still, absorbed in watching the various reunions taking place around her, while the tidal wave gradually subsided, receding in the direction of Main Street. The principal stream had already flowed past her and the crowd was rapidly thinning out when Katherine woke to the realization that she was still unclaimed. There was no sign of Nyoda. The expectant smile faded from Katherine's face and in its place there came a look of puzzled wonder. What had happened? Why wasn't Nyoda there to meet her? Was there some mistake? Wasn't he at this Oakwood? Had she gotten off at the wrong station, she thought in sudden panic. No, there was the sign beside the door of the green-boarded station, its gilded letters gleamed down reassuringly at her. Katherine stood on one foot and pondered. Was this the day she was supposed to come? What day was it, anyway? The thick pad calendar beside the ticket seller's window inside the station proclaimed it to be the 23rd. All right so far, she hadn't mixed up the date, then. She had written Nyoda that she would come on the 23rd, on the 5:45 train. The train had been on time. Where was Nyoda? Katherine was assailed by a sudden doubt. Had she mailed that letter? Yes, she was certain of that. She had run out to the mailbox at 10 o'clock at night especially to mail it. What had gone wrong? Why wasn't there someone to meet her? She looked around at the walls as if expecting them to answer, and her roving eye caught sight of the lettering on a glass door opposite. The telephone. Goose. Why hadn't she thought of that before? Of course there was some mistake responsible for Nyoda's not meeting her, but in a moment that would be all straightened out. She sprang across to the booth and picked up the directory hanging beside the telephone. Then a queer, bewildered look came into her eyes and she stood still with the book hanging unseeingly from her fingers. She had forgotten Nyoda's name. She twisted her brows into a pucker and made a frantic effort to recall it. No use, it was a fruitless endeavor. Where that name used to be in her mind there was now a blank space, empty and echoless as the original void. It was too ridiculous. Katherine gave a little stamp of vexation. It was not the first time a name had popped out of her mind at a critical moment. And sometimes, oh horror! It didn't come back again for days. Was there ever anything so utterly absurd as the plight in which she now found herself? She knew Nyoda's name as well as her own. M.M. It certainly began with an M. After nearly an hour's exasperated racking of her brains she gave it up in disgust and stalked out of the station. Not for worlds would she have confided to anyone her plight. People will think you're an escaped lunatic, she told herself in terrified wrath. They might put you in an asylum, and it would serve you right if they did. You aren't fit to be out without a guardian. After this you'll have to have your destination written out on a label tied to your ankle, like a trunk. She had one recollection to guide her. The house Nyoda lived in stood on top of a hill. The name of Carver House and the address on Oak Street had faded along with Nyoda's name. I'll walk until I come to a house on the top of a hill, she decided, and find it that way. There can't be many houses on hills in this town, it seems to be all in a valley. Come along, Katherine, what you haven't got in your head you two have to have in your heels. No one, seeing the tall, clever-looking girl stepping briskly out of the station and turning up Main Street with a business-like tread, would have guessed that she was a stranger in a strange town and hadn't any idea where she was going. There was such an air of confidence and capability about Katherine that people would have been more likely to ask her to help them out of their difficulties than to suspect that she needed help herself. Certainly, Nyoda's house wouldn't be hard to find. Oakwood lay in a valley, curled up among its sheltering hills like a kitten in a heap of leaves. To be on a hill, Nyoda must be on the outskirts of the town. She inquired of a passing youngster what part of Oakwood was on a hill and got the information that Main Street ran uphill at the end. She set out blithely in the direction he pointed, enjoying the walk flew off the crisp, icy air. A light fall of snow, white as swan's down, covered the ground and the roofs, and sparkled in the light of the street lamps in myriads of tiny twinkles. Not many people were abroad, for it was the supper hour in Oakland. A Christmas stillness hovered over the peaceful little town, as though it lay hushed and breathless in anticipation of the coming of the Holy Babe. Low in the eastern sky burned the brilliant evening star, bright as that other star in the east which guided the shepherds on that far-off Christmas night. Katherine felt the spell of it, and gradually her hasty steps became slower, and at times she stood still and looked upon the quiet scene with a feeling of awe and reverence. Why, it might be Bethlehem, she said to herself. It's so still and white, and there's the star in the east, too. Almost unconsciously she began to repeat under her breath, O little town of Bethlehem, how still we see thee lie, above thy deep and dreamless sleep the silent stars go by. Only it isn't quite TNLE about the deep and dreamless sleep, she qualified, her literal-mindedness getting the upper hand of her poetic feeling, because they are all inside eating supper. The thought of supper made Katherine suddenly realize that she was ravenously hungry. She had had nothing to eat since an early lunch on the train. I hope I get there before supper's over, she thought, and quickened her pace again. Not that she wouldn't get something anyhow, she reflected, but somehow the idea of coming in just as supper was ready, and sitting down to a table covered with steaming dishes seized her fancy and warmed her through with a pleasant glow of expectation. Nearly there, she said to herself cheerfully. Here's where Main Street stands to go uphill. The houses had gradually become farther and farther apart as she went on, until now she was walking along between wide, open spaces, gleaming white in the starlight, with only an occasional low cottage to break the landscape. The walk was steeply uphill now, and looking back Katherine saw Oakwood curled in its sheltering valley, and again she thought of a sleek, well-fed kitten lying warm and comfortable and drowsy, at peace with all the world. There aren't any poor people here, I guess, she thought to herself. All the houses look so prosperous. There probably aren't any hungry children crying for bread. I'm the only hungry person in this whole town, I believe. My, but I am hungry. I could eat a whole house right now, and a barn for dessert. Thank goodness, there's the top of the hill in sight, and that must be Nyoda's house. A great dark bulk towered before her at the top of the steep incline, its irregular outlines standing sharply defined against the luminous sky. Katherine charged up the remainder of the hill at top speed, slipping and falling in the icy path several times in her eagerness, but finally landing intact, though flushed and panting, upon its slippery summit, and stood still to behold this wonderful house that Nyoda lived in, whose charms had been the theme of many an enthusiastic letter from the Winnebagos during the previous summer. It loomed large and silent before her, its frost-covered window panes shining whitely in the starlight with a faint, ghostly glimmer. No gleam of light came from any of the doors or windows. The house was still and dark as a tomb. Katherine stood wide-eyed with disappointment and perplexity. Nyoda was not at home. She clutched at a straw. Nyoda had gone to meet her and missed her, that was it. But at the same time she felt a doubt rising in her mind which rapidly grew into a certainty. This was not Nyoda's house before which she stood on this lonely hilltop. It was some other house, and it was absolutely empty. Not only was it untenanted, but it had the look of a house that has stood so for years. Even the soft, sparkling mantle of snow that lay upon it could not hide the sagging porch, the broken steps, the broken-down fence, the general air of decay which surrounded the place. Katherine emitted a cluck of chagrin. She was puffing like an engine from her dash up the hill, she was tired out, she was ravenously hungry, she was unutterably cross at herself. She scowled at the dark house with its spectral, frosty windows, and made another frantic effort to recall Nyoda's name, only to be confronted with that baffling blank where the name once had been. With a growing feeling of helplessness she stood on one foot in the snow in the pose which she always assumed when thinking deeply, and considered what she should do next. Should she keep on walking and climbing all the hills until she finally came to the right one? Should she go all the way back to the station and sit there until the name came back to her? Or should she walk boldly up to one of the hospitable-looking doors she had passed, confide her plight and ask to be taken in for the night? Katherine was trying to decide between the first two, leaving the third as the extreme alternative in case she neither found the right hill nor succeeded in remembering Nyoda's name before bedtime, when suddenly something occurred which sent a chill of ice into her blood and left her standing petrified in her one-legged pose, like a frozen stalk. From the dark and empty house before her came the sound of a song, ringing clear and distinct through the frosty air. It was the voice of a woman, or a girl. Beginning softly, the tones swelled out in volume till it seemed to Katherine's ears to fill the whole house and to come pouring out of all the doors and windows. Then it subsided until it came view faintly, like the merest ghost of a song. Katherine felt the hair rising on her head, she gave an odd little dry gasp. Wild terror assailed her and she would have fled, but fear chained her limbs and she could not move hand or foot. She stood riveted to the spot, staring fascinated at the dark, untenanted house, which stared back at her with frost-veiled, inscrutable eyes, and all the while from somewhere in its mysterious depths came the voice, now louder, now fainter, but always distinctly heard. A sudden thought struck Katherine. Was she already a victim of starvation, and was this the delirium which starving people went into? They generally heard beautiful voices singing. No, that wasn't possible, she couldn't be starving yet. She was tremendously hungry, but there was still a fairly safe margin between her and the last stages. Somehow the thought of hunger, and the idea of food, commonplace, familiar victuals which it connoted, dissipated the supernatural atmosphere of the place, and Katherine shook off her terror. The blood stopped pounding in her ears, her heart began to beat naturally again, her limbs lost their paralysis. "Goose," she said to herself scornfully. Flying into a panic at the sound of a voice singing and thinking it's ghosts. "I'm ashamed of you, Katherine Adams. Where's your spicuity? Vacant houses don't sing by themselves. When empty houses start singing they aren't empty. Besides, no ghost could sing like that. A voice like that means lungs, and ghosts don't have lungs. Anybody that's got breath to sing can probably talk and tell me where the next hill is. I'm going up and ask her." She passed through an opening in the tumble-down fence, in which there was no longer any gate, and went up the uneven, irregular brick walk and up the broken steps, treading carefully upon each one and half expecting them to go down under her weight. They creaked and trembled, but they held her and she went on over the sagging porch to the door, which lay in deep shadow at the one side. She felt about for a bell or knocker, and then she discovered that the door stood open. She could hear the voice plainly, singing somewhere in the house. Failing to find a doorbell she rapped loudly with her knuckles on the door casing. To her nervous ears the sound seemed to echo inside the house like thunder, but there was no pause in the singing, no sound of footsteps coming to the door. She rapped again. Still no sign from within. A sportive north wind, racing up the hill, paused at the top to whirl about in a mad frolic, and Katherine shivered from head to foot. She felt chilled through, and fairly ached to get inside a house, anywhere to be in out of the cold. She rapped a third time. Still the voice sang on as before, paying no heed to the knock. Katherine grew desperate. Her teeth were chattering in her head and her feet were going numb. Of course she can't hear me knock when she's singing, thought Katherine. The sound of her own voice fills her ears. I'm going in and find her. I'll apologize for walking in on her so unceremoniously, but it's the only thing to do. I've got to get in out of the cold pretty soon. Acting upon her resolution, she stepped through the open door into the hall inside and tried to fix the direction from which the voice was coming. She looked in vain for a glimmer of light under a door to guide her to the mysterious dweller in this strange establishment. The house was apparently as dark on the inside as it looked from without. Katherine opened her handbag and fumbled for her electric flash. In a moment a tiny circle of light was boring valiantly into the gloom. By its gleam Katherine saw that she stood in a long hall. Upon her left was a succession of doors, all closed. Upon her right a staircase curved upward into the blackness above. Idly she turned her flashlight on the staircase and noticed that the post was of beautifully carved mahogany. The polish was gone, but it must have been handsome once, must have been. Katherine gave a great start and nearly dropped her flashlight. Her eyes, travelling up the mahogany stair rail, encountered those of a man who was leaning over the banister halfway up. His face, in the light of her flash, was white as a sheet, and he seemed to be staring not so much at her as at the door behind her, through which she at that moment discovered the voice to be proceeding. Katherine recovered from her surprise and remembered her manners. This man must live here. She must explain quickly, or he would take her for a burglar, coming in that way and looking around with a flashlight. Katherine suddenly felt apprehensive. Suppose he wouldn't believe her story? It was one thing to go into a house in search of a voice that wouldn't come to the door, it was another thing to find a man inside. She cleared her throat and wet her lips. "Excuse me for coming in like this," she began. She got no farther with her apologies. At the sound of her voice the man gave a startled jump, backed away from the banister, ran down the stairs 2 steps at a time and disappeared through the front door, leaving Katherine standing in the empty hall, open-mouthed with astonishment. Chapter 2. The Princess Sylvia. Katherine did not know whether she was more astonished or relieved at the sudden flight of the man on the stairs. Suppose I do look pretty wild, she reflected, but I didn't suppose my appearance was enough to make a man run on sight. Well, anyhow, he isn't going to trouble me, and that's some comfort. Now to find the singer. There was an open transom over the door before which Katherine stood, and she perceived that the voice came through this. With hand raised to knock on the door panel she paused in admiration. The song that floated through the transom had such a gay swing, such an irresistible lilt, that it set her head a-whirl and her blood racing madly through her veins in a wild May dance. It was as though spring herself, intoxicated with May dew and brimming over with all the joy of all the world, were singing. Like golden drops from a sunlit fountain the gay, glad notes showered down on her. Hark, hark! The lark at heaven's gate sings, and Busgins arise his steeds to water at those springs on chaliced flower that lies, and winking merry buds begin to ope their golden eyes, with everything that pretty been. 114, Lady sweet arise. The voice fell silent, and Katherine came back to herself and knocked on the door. Come in, my dear Duchess, called a merry voice from behind the door. There was no mistaking the note of glad welcome. Katherine turned the knob and opened the door. Only darkness greeted her eyes. Where are you? She asked. From somewhere in the room came a sudden exclamation of surprise. Who is it? Demanded the voice which had bidden her enter. You are not my lady in waiting, the Duchess. I'm afraid I'm not, said Katherine, considerably puzzled at the salutation she had received. She stood still inside the door trying to locate her mysterious hostess in the darkness. Her flashlight lay in her hand, useless, its battery burned out. I'm looking for another house on another hill, she began hurriedly, speaking into the darkness and feeling as though she had slipped into the Arabian Nights, and I got the wrong hill and now I'm so mixed up I don't know where to go. I heard you singing and came in to ask if you could tell me where the other hill is. I knocked before I came in, she added hastily, but you didn't come to the door, so I took the liberty of walking in. I beg your pardon for coming right in that way, but I was so cold. You are welcome in our lodge, interrupted the invisible voice with lofty graciousness. Do you not know where you have come? It continued, in a tone which indicated there was a delicious surprise in store. This is the Royal Hunting Lodge, and I am the Princess Sylvia. Oh, said Katherine, too much astonished to say another word. She did not know how to act when introduced to a princess. Is there anything I can do for your majesty? She asked politely, remembering that the other had mentioned a lady in waiting that she seemed to be expecting. Light the lights, commanded the voice imperiously. Katherine took a step forward uncertainly. Where? Began. On the table beside you, continued the voice. Katherine put out her hand and came in contact with the edge of a table, and after groping for a moment found a box of matches. She stnlck one and by its flare saw an oil lamp standing on the table beside the matches. She lit it and looked around the room curiously. She could not see the owner of the voice at first. The room was large and shadowy and contained very little furniture. A bare pine table on which the lamp stood, a couple of kitchen chairs, a cot bed next to the wall, a small stove, a rocking chair and a sewing machine, these were the objects which the lamp illuminated. The other end of the room lay in deep shadow. It was from this shadow that the voice now issued again. Bring the lamp and come here, it commanded. Katherine picked up the lamp from the table and advanced toward the shadowy corner of the room. The darkness fled before her as she advanced and the corner sprang into light. She saw that the comer was a bay, with 3 long windows, in which stood a couch. On the couch was a mountain whose slopes consisted of vari-colored piecework, and from whose peak there issued, like an eruption of golden lava, a tangle of bright yellow curls which framed about a pair of big, shining eyes. The eyes were set in a face, of course, they had to be, but the face was so white and emaciated as to be entirely inconspicuous, so Katherine's first impression consisted entirely of hair and eyes. The eyes were dark brown, a strange combination with the fair hair, and sparkled with 100 little dancing lights, as the girl on the couch, for it was a girl apparently about 14 years old, looked up at Katherine with a roguish smile. You must be Her Grace, the Marchioness St. Denis, she said with an air of stately courtesy, of whose presence in our realm we have been informed. I trust your Grace is not over-fatigued. You will pardon the informality of our life here, she continued, her brown eyes travelling around the room and resting somewhat regretfully on the shabby furnishings. We take up our residence in the Winter Palace for state occasions, she went on, but for our daily life we prefer the simplicity of our hunting lodge. We are less hampered by formal etiquette here. Katherine stared in perplexity. Winter Palace? Hunting lodge? Her Grace the Marchioness? What was this strange child talking about? Her feeling of having wakened in the midst of a fairy tale deepened. You can see the Winter Palace from the window here, when there isn't any frost on it, proceeded the princess, setting up a volcanic disturbance inside the patchwork mountain by turning herself inside of it, and she pointed toward one of the bay windows with a thin white hand. It's on top of a high hill and at night it twinkles. It came over Katherine in a flash that possibly it was Nyoda's house that this queer child meant by the Winter Palace. A big house set on a high hill, a rippling laugh caused her to look down hastily, and there was the girl on the couch fairly convulsed with laughter. It's been such fun, she exclaimed, demolishing the mountain by throwing the quilt aside with a sudden movement of her arms and disclosing a slender little body wrapped in a greyish woolen dressing gown. Elle never had anybody from outside to play it with before. I get tired playing it alone so much, and Aunt Aggie is mostly always too busy to play it with me. Besides, she said with a regretful sigh, she has no imagination, and she forgets most of the really important things. Oh, it was wonderful when you said, "Is there anything I can do for you, Your Majesty?" It was just as real as real. She laughed with delight at the remembrance. Katherine, as much startled by the swift change in her little hostess as she had been at her strange manner of speech in the beginning, was still uncertain what to say. "Is it a game?" she asked finally. The girl nodded and began to explain, talking as though to an old friend. "You see," she began, "not being able to walk, it's so hard to find anything really thrilling to do." "You're lame?" asked Katherine with quick sympathy. It had just come over her that while the slender arms had been waving incessantly in animated gestures as the voice chattered gaily on, the limbs under the dressing gown had not moved. The girl nodded in reply to Katherine's question. "Crippled," she explained. "I was following a horse down the middle of the street trying to figure out which leg came after which when I slipped and fell and hurt my spine, and I have never walked since." "Oh," said Katherine with a shudder of distress. "And so," continued the girl, "to pass away the time while Aunt Aggie was working I began to pretend that I was a princess and lived in a palace with my indulgent father, the king, and had a grand court and a great train of attendants, all dukes and duchesses and counts and things, and a royal grand duchess for my lady-in-waiting. That one is Aunt Aggie, of course, and it's great fun to pretend she's the duchess. My dear Duchess," she cried, giving an animated sample of her make-believe, "what do you say to having our cousin, the Crown Prince, in to tea? Then Aunt Aggie always forgets and says, 'Let's see, which one is the Crown Prince, now?' It's very disconcerting, the way the Grand Duchess forgets her royal relations." She giggled infectiously and Katherine smiled too. "What is your real name, Princess Sylvia?" she asked. "Sylvia Dean," replied the girl. "Only the princess part is made up. My name is Sylvia. Her teeth began to chatter on the last words and she drew the quilt up around her tightly. Katherine suddenly felt cold, too. Then she became conscious for the first time that there was no heat in the room. In the first contrast to the biting wind outside, the place had seemed warm, and with her heavy fur-collared winter coat she had not felt chilly. She glanced at the stove. It was black and lifeless. "The FFI's GG gone zero UT," chattered Sylvia, huddling under the quilt as a fierce blast rattled the panes in the bay windows. Katherine felt hot with indignation at the thought of the invalid left all alone in the cold room. "Where is your lady-in-waiting?" she asked, a trifle sharply. "Aunt Aggie's gone to the city," replied Sylvia. "She went at 6 o'clock this morning and she was going to back at noon. She hasn't come yet, and I'm so cold and—" She checked herself suddenly and held her head up very stiffly. Katherine turned abruptly and made for the stove. It was a small old-fashioned cook stove, the kind that Katherine had been familiar with in her childhood on the fan. Beside it in a box were several lumps of coal and some kindling. She stripped off her gloves and set to work building a fire. When the stove had begun to radiate heat, she lifted Sylvia, quilt and all, into the rocking chair and drew it up in front of the fire. "And now, if you'll tell me where things are, I'll prepare your Majesty's supper," she said playfully. "Thank you, but I'm not hungry," replied Sylvia. "Don't see how you can help being," said Katherine wonderingly. "Or have you had something to eat since your aunt went away?" she added. "No," replied Sylvia. "Then you must be famished," said Katherine decidedly, "and I'm going to get you something." She moved toward a cupboard on the wall over in a corner of the room where she conjectured the supplies must be kept. The cupboard had leaded glass doors, she noticed, and the framework was of mahogany to match the woodwork of the room. It had probably been designed as a curio cabinet by the builder of the house. "Never mind, I don't want anything to eat," said Sylvia again, in a tone which was both commanding and pleading. "You must," said Katherine firmly, with her hand on the cut glass knob of the cupboard door. "You're cold because you're hungry." She opened the door and investigated the inside. There were some cheap china dishes and some pots and pans, but no sign of food. She glanced swiftly around the room, but nowhere else were there any supplies. Then Katherine understood. Her intuition was slow, but finally it came to her why Sylvia did not want to admit that she was hungry. There was nothing to eat in the house. There was a pinched, blue look about Sylvia's face that Katherine had seen before, in the settlement where she had worked with Miss Fairley. She recognized the hunger look. Sylvia met her eye with an attempt at lofty unconcern. "Our royal larder," she remarked, valiantly struggling to maintain her royal dignity, "is exhausted at present. I must speak to my steward about it." Then her air of lofty composure forsook her all at once, and with a little wailing cry of Aunt Aggie, she put her head down on the arm of the chair and wept, pulling the quilt over her face so that Katherine could not see her cry. Katherine was beside her in an instant, seeking to comfort her, and struggling with an unwanted desire to cry herself. The thought of the brave little spirit, shut up alone here in the dark and cold, hungry and anxious, singing like a lark to keep down her loneliness and anxiety, and welcoming her chance guest with the gracious air of a princess, moved Katherine as nothing had ever done before. "Tell me all about it," she said, cuddling the golden head close. Sylvia stmggled manfully to regain her composure, and sat up and dashed the tears away with an impatient hand. "How dare you cry, and you a princess," she said aloud to herself scumfully, with a flash of her brown eyes, and Katherine caught a glimpse of an indomitable spirit that no hardship could bow down. "'Twas but a momentary weakness," she said to Katherine, with a rhythm of her royal manner. Katherine felt like saluting. "We've been having a hard time since Uncle Joe died," began Sylvia. "He was sick a long time and it took all the money he had saved. Then Aunt Aggie got sick after he died and isn't strong enough yet to do hard work. She makes shirts. There's a shop here that lets her take work home. You see, she can't leave me." Here Sylvia gave an impatient poke at her useless limbs. "We came here from Millvale, where we used to live, a month ago. We couldn't find any place to live, so Aunt Aggie got permission from the town to come and live in here until we could find a place. Nobody seems to own this house, that is, nobody knows who owns it, it's been empty so long. Aunt Aggie sold all her furniture to pay her debts except her sewing machine and the few things we have here. Aunt Aggie makes shirts, but her eyes gave out this week and she couldn't do anything, so there wasn't any pay. Aunt Aggie got credit for a while at the store, but yesterday they refused her, so we played that we would keep a fast today in honor of our pious grandfather, the king, who always used to fast for 3 days before Christmas. Aunt Aggie only had enough money to go to the city and get glasses from somebody there that would make them for nothing for her, so she could go on sewing. She went on the earliest train this morning and expected to get back by noon. I can't think what's keeping her so late." Katherine looked at her watch. It was 7:30. She wondered if the shops were still open so that she could go out and buy groceries. She began to draw on her gloves. "Don't go away," pleaded Sylvia, catching hold of her hand in alarm. "Stay here till she comes." "Oh, why doesn't she come? I know something's happened to her. She's never left me alone so long before. Oh, what will I do if she doesn't come back?" Fear seized her with icy hands and her face worked pitifully. "Aunt Aggie! Aunt Aggie!" she cried aloud in terror. Katherine soothed her as best she could, mentioning all the possible things that could have occurred to delay her in the N1 of holiday travel. Sylvia looked reassured after a bit and Katherine was just on the point of running out to get some supper for her when there was a sound of feet on the creaking steps outside. "Here she comes now," said Sylvia with a great sigh of relief. The footsteps crossed the porch and then stopped. Instead of the sound of front door opening as they expected, there came a heavy knock. "How queer," said Sylvia, "she never knocks. There's no one to let her in." Katherine hastened out to the hall door. A man stood outside. "Does Mrs. Dean live in this house?" he asked. "Yes," said Katherine. "I'm Mr. Grossman, the man she works for," he said. Katherine admitted him. "The girl, is she here?" he asked. Katherine brought him into the room. Sylvia looked up inquiringly. Without greeting or preamble he blurted out, "Your auntie, she's been hurt. Somebody just telephoned me from such a hospital in the city. She was run over by a taxicab and her collarbone broke and her head hurt. She's now by the hospital. She tells them to tell me and I should let you know." He stopped talking and whirled his hat around in his hand as though ill at ease. Sylvia sank back in her chair, dead white, her eyes staring at him with a curiously intent gaze, as though trying to comprehend the size of the calamity which had befallen her. Tingling with pity, Katherine looked into Sylvia's anguished eyes, and in the stress of emotion she suddenly remembered Nyoda's name. Sheridan. Sheridan. Mrs. Andrew Sheridan. Carver House. 241 Oak Street. How could she ever have forgotten it? "What's going to become of me?" cried Sylvia in a terrified voice. Mr. Grossman shifted his weight from one foot to the other and scratched his head reflectively. Then he shrugged his shoulders helplessly. He was a Russian Jew, living with his numerous family in a few small rooms over his shop, and what to do with this lame girl who knew not a soul in town was too much of a problem for him. To his evident relief, Katherine came to the rescue. "Elle will take care of her," she said briefly. She opened her handbag and fished for pencil and paper. "Go out and telephone this person," she directed, after scribbling for a minute, "and give her the message written down there." Mr. Grossman departed, much relieved at being freed from all responsibility regarding Sylvia, and Katherine sat down beside her little princess and endeavoured to soothe her distress of mind regarding her aunt. Finally the warmth of the stove made her drowsy and she fell into a doze with her head on Katherine's shoulder. Half an hour later the long blast of an automobile hum woke the echoes in front of the house. Sylvia half awakened and murmured sleepily, "Here come the king's huntsmen." Katherine slipped out through the front door and flung herself upon a fur-coated figure that was coming up the walk, followed by a man. "Nyoda." "Katherine? What in the world are you doing here?" Katherine explained briefly how she came there. "But I never received your letter," cried Nyoda in astonishment. "Elle thought you were coming tomorrow with the other girls." Poor Katherine, to come all alone and then not find anybody to meet you. "I'm so sorry." "But it wouldn't be you, Katherine," she finished with a laugh, "if everything went smoothly. Now tell me the important thing your message said you wanted to tell me." Katherine spoke earnestly for a few minutes, at the end of which Nyoda nodded emphatically. "Certainly," she said heartily. A minute later Katherine gently roused the sleeping princess. "What is it, my dear Duchess?" asked Sylvia drowsily. "Come, Your Majesty," said Katherine, beginning to wrap the quilt around her, "make ready for your journey. We leave at once for the Winter Palace." Chapter 3. The Shuttered Window. "Nyoda, isn't there a secret passage in this house somewhere?" asked Sawa eagerly, pausing with the nutcracker held open in her hand. "There generally was one in these old houses, you know." Christmas dinner was just drawing to a close in the big, holly-hung dining room at Carver House, and the merry group of young folks who composed Nyoda's Christmas house party, too languid after their strenuous attack upon the turkey and plum pudding to rise from their chairs, lingered around the table to hear Nyoda tell stories of Carver House, while the ruddy glow from the big log in the fireplace dispelled the gloom of the failing winter afternoon. It was a jolly party that gathered around the historical old mahogany dining table, which had witnessed so many other festivities in the 150 years of its existence. At the head sat Sherry, Nyoda's soldier husband, still pale and thin from his long illness, and with a long jagged scar showing through the closely cropped hair on one side of his head. He had never returned to duty after the wreck in which he had so nearly lost his life. While he was still in the military hospital to which he had been removed from the little emergency hospital at St. Margaret's where the sharp battle for life had been fought and won, There came that day when the last shot was fired, and when he was ready to leave the hospital he came home to Carver House to stay. Opposite him, at the foot of the table, sat Nyoda, girlish and enthusiastic as ever, with only an occasional sober light in her twinkling eyes to tell of the trying year she had passed through. Along both sides of the table between them were ranged 5 of the Winnebagos, Katherine, Sawa, Migwan, Himpahara and Gladys, and in among them, like weeds among the posers as the captain laughingly put it, were Slim and the captain, Slim filled to the bursting point as usual, and looking more than ever like an overgrown cherub. Across from these two sat a third youth, so slender and fine-featured as to seem almost frail in comparison with Slim's overflowing stoutness. This was Justice Dalrymple, Katherine's professor now engaged in his experimental work at Washington, whence Nyoda had invited him up for her Christmas house party as a surprise for Katherine. Agony and Opshaw, whom Nyoda had also invited to come over to the house party, was spending the holidays with an aunt in New York and could not come, much to Sawa's disappointment, who had not seen them since the summer before. Veronica was ill at her uncle's home and also could not be with them. Enthroned beside Katherine in a great carved armchair that had come over from England with the first carvers, sat Sylvia Dean, looking very much like a Stowe-book princess. With their customary open-heartedness, the Winnebagos had already made her feel as though she were an old friend of theirs. The romantic way in which Katherine had found her appealed to their imaginations and added to their interest in her. Beside that, there was a fascinating something about her dark eyes and light hair that kept drawing their eyes to her face as though it were a magnet. There was so much animation in her voice when she talked that the most commonplace thing she said seemed extremely diverting. Her eyes had a way of suddenly lighting up as though a lamp had been kindled inside of her, and when she talked about other people her voice would take on a perfect mimic one-way of their intonations and expressions. She showed not the slightest embarrassment at being thus transplanted into a strange household, so much more splendid than anything she was accustomed to. She was entirely at her ease in the great house, and acted as though she had been used to luxurious surroundings all her life. Katherine was secretly surprised to find her so completely unabashed. She herself was still prone to make ridiculous blunders in the presence of strangers, and was still ill at ease when anyone looked critically at her. They were all some reason to learn that Sylvia was 18 years old, instead of 14 as they had all thought when they first saw her. Her slender, childlike form, and her short, curly hair made her look much younger than she really was. The animated talk that had accompanied the first part of the dinner gradually died away, as a sense of repleteness and languor succeeded to eager appetites, and conversation had begun to lag, when Sawa stirred it into life again by asking if there was not a secret passage in Carver House. A ripple of interest went around the table, and all the girls and boys began to sit up and take notice. "Haven't you had enough adventures yet to satisfy you?" asked Sherry quizzically. "Aren't you content with fishing a lieutenant out of the devil's punch bowl the last time you were here, that you must begin again looking for excitement? By the way, where is this young Allison?" "Still across," replied Sawa. "His last letter said he would be there for 6 months yet. He's going on into Germany. He isn't a lieutenant anymore. He's a captain." "Captain Allison?" asked Justice. "Captain Robert Allison? You don't mean to say that you know Bob Allison?" "Does she know Captain Allison?" echoed Himpahara. "Who sent her that spiked helmet, and that piece of marble from Reims Cathedral and that French flag with the bullet holes in it, to say nothing of that package of French chocolates? But, of course, you didn't know," she added, remembering that Justice had only met Sawa the day before. "Do you know Captain Allison?" asked Sawa. "Best friend I had in college," replied Justice. "He was dreaming of flying machines then. Bob Allison, the fellow you pulled out of the water. It seems that all my friends, as well as my family, are going to get mixed up with you girls. It seems like fate. Wherever the Winnebagos come there's sure to be something doing," said the captain. "I wonder what the next thing will be." What's this about secret passages now? With so much paneling, continued Sylvia, it seems as if there must be a hollow panel somewhere that would slide back and reveal a passage behind it. Isn't there one, Nyoda? There may be one, for all I know, replied Nyoda, but I have never found it if there is. I have never looked for any such thing. It takes all my time, she proclaimed with a comic tragic air, to keep all the open passages in this place clean, without looking for any more behind panels. Do you care if we try to find one? Asked Sylvia eagerly. I just feel it in my bones that there is one somewhere. Search all you like, replied Nyoda, with an amused laugh. Oh goody, exclaimed Sylvia. Let's begin right away. She rose from the table and the rest followed, much taken up with this new quest, and the search began immediately. Upstairs and downstairs they tapped, peered, pried and investigated, but without success. One by one they abandoned the quest and drifted into the library, where Nyoda and Sherry and Sylvia sat in a close group before the fire, Sherry smoking, Nyoda reading aloud, and Sylvia watching the images in the fire. Sylvia and the captain were the last to give up, but finally they, too, drifted in and joined the ranks of the unsuccessful hunters. Nyoda paused in her reading and looked up with a smile as Sylvia and the captain came in. What have you to report, my darling scouts? She asked gravely. Nothing, replied the captain, rather sheepishly. Sylvia rubbed her fingers tenderly. There are miles of oak paneling in this house, she remarked wearily, and I've rapped on every inch of it with my knuckles, until they are just pulp, but not one of those panels sounded hollow. Poor child, said Nyoda sympathetically. You should have done the way the captain did, said Slim. He used his head to knock with instead of his knuckles, it's harder. A scuffle seemed imminent, and was only averted by Sylvia's next remark. Nyoda, she asked, where does that door at the head of the stairs lead to, the one that is locked? It was locked last summer when we were here, too. That, replied Nyoda, is the room Uncle Jasper used as his study. I've been using it as a sort of storeroom for furniture. There were a number of pieces in the house that didn't quite fit in with the rest of the furniture, and I set them in there until I could make up my mind what to do with them. I didn't want to dispose of them without consulting Shenny, and as he has been away from home ever since we have lived here until just now, we have never had time to go over the stuff together. As the room looks cluttered with those odd pieces in there, I have kept it locked. Your uncle's study, exclaimed Sylvia. 01-1, I wonder if there wouldn't be a concealed door in there. It seems such a likely place. Would you care very much if we went and looked there? Nyoda laughed at Sylvia's eagerness in her quest. You're a TNLE Winnebago, she said fondly. Never leave a stone unturned when you're re-looking for anything. I might as well say yes now as later, because I know you will never rest until I have investigated that room. You're worse than Bluebeard's wife. I have no objections to your going in if I are to excuse the disorderly look of the place and the dust that has undoubtedly collected by this time. I'll get you the key. With the prospect of a fresh field for investigation, the others revived their interest in the search and followed Nyoda eagerly as she led the way upstairs and unlocked the closed door at the head. A faint, musty odor greeted their nostrils, the close atmosphere of a room which has been shut up, although the moonlight flooding the place through the long windows gave it an almost airy appearance. Nyoda found the electric light button and presently the room was brilliantly lighted from the chandelier. The Winnebagos trooped in and looked curiously about them at the queer old desks and tables and cabinets that stood about. Sylvia's attention was immediately drawn to the window at the far end of the room. She knew it was a window because it was framed in a mahogany casement like the other windows in the house, but instead of a pane of glass there was a dark, opaque space inside the casement. Sylvia ran over to it at once, and a little exclamation of astonishment escaped her as she examined it. On the inside of the glass, if there was a pane of glass there, was a heavy black iron shutter fastened to the casement with great screws. What did you put up this shutter for, Nyoda? Asked Sylvia wonderingly. The others all came crowding over then to exclaim over the iron shutter. "I didn't put it up," replied Nyoda. "It was there when I came here." "But what's it for?" persisted Sylvia. "Is the window behind it broken?" "No, it doesn't seem to be," replied Nyoda. "I looked at it from the outside." "Then what can it be for?" repeated Sylvia. "Don't know, I can't imagine," replied Nyoda. A note of wonder was creeping into her voice. "To tell the truth," she said, "never thought anything about it. I noticed that there was an iron shutter over that window when we first came here, but I was too much taken up with Sherry's going away then even to wonder about it. The room has been closed up ever since and I had forgotten all about it. It does seem a queer thing, now that you call my attention to it. But Uncle Jasper did so many eccentric things, I'm not surprised at anything he might have done. We'll take the shutter off in the morning and see if we can discover any reason for having it there. Now, aren't you going to hunt for the secret passage after I've opened the door for you?" she said quizzically. "There's still an hour or so before bedtime, long enough for all of you to complete the distinction of your knuckles." Again the house resounded with the tapping of knuckles against hardwood paneling, until it sounded as though an army of giant woodpeckers were at work, but the eager searchers continued to bruise their long-suffering knuckles in vain. The paneling in Uncle Jasper's study was as solid as the Great Wall of China. Chapter 4. An interview with Hercules. Among the furniture stored in the study was one piece which Nyoda had pounced upon with an exclamation of joy the night before when she opened the room to please the Winnebagos. That was an invalid's wheelchair. "Just the thing for Sylvia," she exclaimed delightedly. "She can get around the house by herself in this. It's a good thing you got curious about this room, Sylvia dear. I'm afraid I wouldn't have thought of opening it until spring. I remember now, Uncle Jasper had a paralytic stroke some months before he died which left him lame, and he went about in a wheelchair during his last days. This certainly comes in handy now." The morning after Sylvia had discovered the iron shutter, Sylvia was set in the wheelchair and rolled into the study, and the rest came flocking up to watch Shenny and the boys remove the shutter. It was no easy job, taking that shutter off, for the screws had rusted in so that it was almost impossible to turn them. Nyoda gave an exclamation of dismay at the holes left in the mahogany casement. The Winnebagos were too much absorbed in the window which was revealed by the removal of the shutter to pay any attention to the damaged casement. Unlike the other windows in the room, which were of clear glass, this one was composed of tiny leaded panes in colors. It was so dirty on the outside that it was impossible to see what it really was like. Sylvia hastened out and got cleaning rags and washed it inside and out, standing on the roof of the side porch to get at it on the outside, because it did not open. When it was clean, and the bright sun shone through it, the beauty of the window stnlck them dumb. The leaded panes were wrought into a design of climbing roses, growing over a little arched gateway, the rich red and green tints of the flowers and leaves glowing splendid in the mellow light that streamed through it. After a moment of breathless silence, the Winnebagos found their voices and broke into admiring cries. Himpaha promptly went into raptures. "Why, you can almost smell those roses, they are so natural. Oh, the darling archway. Did you ever see anything so beautiful? Don't you just long to go through it? Oh, why did your uncle ever have that horrible old shutter put over it? Maybe he was afraid it would get broken," suggested Gladys. "But why would he put the shutter on the inside?" asked Sylvia shrewdly. "There would be more danger of the windows getting broken from the outside than from the inside, I should think." "There wouldn't be with Slim around," said the captain, and prudently barricaded himself behind a bookcase in the cummer. Slim gave him a withering glance, but did not deign to follow him and open an attack. He could not have squeezed in behind the bookcase, so he ignored the thrust. "I wonder why he didn't put shutters on the other windows also," said Katherine. "Lucy, I'm glad he didn't," said Nyoda with a shiver, eyeing the ugly screw holes in the smooth mahogany casement with housewifely horror at such marring of beauty. One set of holes like that is enough. Isn't it just like a man, though, to put screws into that woodwork? It's time a woman owned this house. A few more generations of eccentric bachelors and the place would be ruined. But said Salwa musingly, didn't you tell us once that this house was the pride of your uncle's health, and he never would let any children in for fear they would scratch the floors and furniture? That's so, too, replied Nyoda. Uncle Jasper was so fond of this house that it was a byword among the relations. He loved it as though it were his own child. How he ever allowed anyone to put screws into that mahogany casement is a mystery. Don't you think, said Salwa shrewdly, that there must have been some great and important reason for putting up that shutter? A reason that made him forget all about the holes he was making in the woodwork. A little thrill went through the group. All at once they seemed to feel that they were standing in the shadow of some mystery. What kind of a man was your Uncle Jasper? Asked Salwa. He was a queer, silent man, replied Nyoda, sitting down on the edge of a table and nibbing her forehead to aid her recollection. He was an author, wrote historical works. I confess I don't know a great deal about him. I only saw him twice, once when I was a very little girl and once a few years ago. He never corresponded with any of his relations and never visited them nor had them come to visit him. Most everybody was afraid of him, he was so grim and stern-looking. He couldn't have been very sociable here either, for none of the people of Oakwood seemed to have been in the habit of calling on him. None of those that called on me had ever been inside the house before. The old man didn't mix with the neighbors, they said. He seldom went outside the house. No one seems to know much about him. Of course, she added, living up here on the hill he was sort of by himself, there are no near neighbors. Maybe he put up that shutter for protection, suggested Himpaha. With all the other windows in the house unshuttered, asked the captain derisively. A lot of protection that would be. Besides, do you think the neighbors were in the habit of shooting pop guns at him? Well, can you think of any other reason? Retorted Himpaha. Why don't you ask old Hercules? Suggested Salwa. He might know. To be sure, cried Nyoda, springing down from the table. Why didn't I think of Hercules before? Of course he'd know. He was with Uncle Jasper all his life. I'll call him in and ask him and we'll have the mystery cleared up in a jiffy. Will one of you boys go out and bring him in? The captain and Justice sprang up simultaneously in answer to her request and raced for the stable. In a few minutes they were back, bringing old Hercules with them. Hercules had a somewhat forlorn air about him, like that of a dog without a master. Nyoda said he was grieving for Uncle Jasper, Shenny said it was the goat he was mauming for. At any rate, he was a pathetic figure as he hobbled painfully up the stairs one step at a time on his shaky, stiff old limbs. His eyes brightened a bit as he saw the door into Uncle Jasper's study standing open, and he looked around the room with an affectionate gaze as the boys piloted him in. Nyoda saw his eyes rest on the window from which the shutter had been removed, and it seemed to her that he gave a start and gazed through the window apprehensively. Hercules, said Nyoda briskly, we've just taken this ugly old shutter off that stained glass window, and we're curious to know why it was put up. It seems such a pity to have put those great screws into that mahogany casement. Why did Uncle Jasper put it up? Hercules scratched his head and shifted his corncob pipe to the other side of his mouth. That shutter's been up a good many years, Miss Lisbeth, he quavered. I see it has, from the way the screws were rusted in, replied Nyoda. But why was it put up? That shutter's been dear 25 years, reiterated the old man solemnly, still looking at it in a half-fascinated, half-apprehensive way. Yes, yes, said Nyoda, trying to control her impatience. But why has it been there all this time? Why did Uncle Jasper put it up? Hercules scratched his head again, and replaced his pipe in its original position. I disremember, Miss Lisbeth, he said deprecatingly. It's been so long since. My memory's been powerful bad lately, Miss Lisbeth. Seems like I can't remember hardly anything. It's the misery, Miss Lisbeth, it's settled in my memory. He carefully avoided her eyes. Please try to remember, said Nyoda, trying hard to hold on to her patience, but morally certain that Hercules was trying to sidestep her questions. Think, now. 25 years ago Uncle Jasper put up an iron shutter to cover the most beautiful window in Carver House. Why did he do it? Nyoda turned so that she looked right into his face, and her compelling black eyes held his shifty gaze steady. There was something strangely magnetic about Nyoda's eyes. People could avoid answering her questions as long as they did not look into her eyes, but once let her catch your gaze, and things she wanted to know had a habit of coming out of their own accord. Hercules seemed to be on the point of speaking. He cleared his throat nervously and shifted the pipe once more. Nyoda cast a triumphant glance at Sherry. In that instant Hercules shifted his gaze from her face and met another pair of eyes, eyes that seemed to look at him accusingly, and sent a chilling down his spine. These were none other than the eyes of Uncle Jasper, who, hanging in his frame on the study wall, seemed to be looking straight at him, in the way that eyes in pictures have. When Nyoda glanced back at Hercules he was staring uneasily at Uncle Jasper's picture and there was a guilty look about him as if he had been caught in a misdemeanor. Claire, I can't remember nothing about why that shutter was put up, Miss Lisbeth, he said earnestly. Come to think on it now, Mas Jasper ain't never told me why he wanted put up, he continued triumphantly. He just say, Hercules, put up that shutter, and he ain't ever say why. I asked him, Mas Jasper, what for you putting up that shutter over that window, and he say, Hercules, you put up that shutter and mind your business. I ain't telling why I wants it put up, I just wants it put up, that's all. No, Miss Lisbeth, I's often wondered myself about that shutter, but I never found out nothing. He glanced up at Uncle Jasper's picture as though expecting some token of approval from the stem, grim face. Nyoda saw it was no use trying to get anything out of Hercules. Either he really did not know anything, or he would not tell. You may go, Hercules, she said. That's all we wanted of you. Hercules looked unaccountably relieved and started for the door. Halfway across the room he turned and looked long. Through the clear panel of glass underneath the archway of the gate in the stained glass window. He stood still, seemingly lost in reverie, and quite oblivious to the group about him. Finally his lips began to move, and he began to mutter to himself, and Sawashan, ears caught the sound of the words. Days tings, muttered the old man, that folks don't want to look at, and days tings they dasn't look at. Still lost in reverie he shuffled out of the room and hobbled painfully downstairs. Chapter 5. The first link. What did old Hercules mean? Asked Sawa in astonishment. He said, days some tings folks don't want to look at, and days tings they dasn't look at. Can't imagine, said Nyoda, thoroughly mystified. But there's one thing sure, and that is, Uncle Jasper had some very potent reason for putting that shutter over that window, and I more than half believe Hercules knows what it was. Hercules' explanations always become very fluent when he is not telling the TNLTH. If he really hadn't known anything about it he probably would have said so simply, in about 3 words, and without any hesitation. The elaborate details he went into to convince me that he knew nothing about it sounds suspicious to me. But I don't believe the exclamation he made when he went out was intended to deceive me. I think it was the involuntary utterance of what was in his thoughts. He seemed to be thinking aloud, and was quite unconscious of our presence. But what a queer thing to say, days tings people dasn't look at. I wonder what it was that Uncle Jasper dared not look at. Was it something he saw through this window? What is there to be seen out of this window, anyway? She moved over in front of the window with the others crowding after her to see, too. Uncle Jasper's study was at the back of the house and the windows looked out upon the wide open meadow which stretched behind Carver Hill, between the town and the woods. The front of Carver House looked out over the town. Nearly half a mile to the east of Carver Hill another hill rose sharply from the town's edge. Upon its top stood another old-fashioned dwelling. This hill, crowned with its red brick mansion, was framed in the arch of the gateway in the window like an artist's picture, with nothing between to obstruct the view. A beautiful picture it was, certainly, and one which could not possibly have any connection with Hercules' muttered words. "Who lives in that house?" asked Sawa. "Don't know," said Nyoda. "It's way up on the main street hill. I'm not acquainted with the people in that end of town." Sherry got out his binoculars and took a look through the window. "Nothing but an old house on a hill," he reported, and handed the binoculars to Sylvia, that she might take a look through them. "Why," said Sylvia after peering intently through the glasses for a minute, "it's the house Aunt Aggie and I live in." "What did that old house have to do with your Uncle Jasper?" she asked, wondering. "It's been empty for many, many years. Wouldn't it be wonderful if there was a romance in your Uncle Jasper's life?" exclaimed Himpahar eagerly. "A blighted romance? He never married, did he?" "No, he never married," replied Nyoda. "Then I'm sure it's a blighted romance," said Himpahar enthusiastically. "I just know that some deep tragedy darkened the sun of his life and left him shrouded in gloom forever after." Even Nyoda smiled at Himpahar's sentimental language, and the rest could not help laughing out loud. "You sound like Lady Imogen in The Lost Heiress," said Katherine derisively. "Well, I don't care, you'll have to admit that there are some very romantic possibilities, anyway," said Himpahar stoutly. "Yes, and some very prosaic ones, too," retorted Katherine. "Uncle Jasper probably never married because he was a born bachelor, and preferred to live alone." "Oh, Katherine, why are you always taking the joy out of life?" wailed Himpahar. "It's lots more fun to think romantic things about people than dull, stupid, everyday things." "I'll think so too," said Sawa, unexpectedly coming to the defense of Himpahar. "I've been thinking a lot about old Mr. Carver, living alone here all those years, and I've wondered if there wasn't some reason for it. Certainly something happened that made him put that shutter up, that's clear. Well, whatever motive the old man may have had for putting it up, we'll probably never find it out," said Sherry, gathering up the screws and screwdriver. "Inasmuch as he's dead and it's no use asking Hercules anything, so we might as well stop puzzling over it. I'll hunt up something to fill in those screw holes with, Elizabeth, and polish them over." Sherry, in his matter-of-fact way, had already dismissed the matter from his mind as not worth bothering over. Not so Nyoda and the Winnebagos. The merest hint of a possible missed one connected with the shutter set them on fire with curiosity and desire to penetrate into its depths. "I wonder," said Nyoda musingly, eyeing the massive desk before her with a speculative glance, "if Uncle Jasper left any record of the repairs and improvements which he made to the house while he was the owner. The item of the shutter might be mentioned, with the reason for putting it up." "It might," agreed the Winnebagos. Nyoda looked around at the litter of odd pieces of furniture crowding the room. "Sherry," she said briskly, "make up your mind this minute whether you want any of that old stuff, because I'm going to clear it out of here and sell it." "A lot of good it would do me to make up my mind to want any of it, if you've made up your mind to sell it," said Sherry in a comically plaintive tone. "All right," responded Nyoda tranquilly, "knew you didn't want any of it. Boys, will you help Sherry carry out those 2 tables and that high desk and the chiffonier, all the oak furniture? I'm not keeping anything but the mahogany. Set it out in the hall, I'll have the furniture man come and get it tomorrow. There, now the room looks as it did when Uncle Jasper inhabited it," she remarked when the extra pieces had been cleared out. "It certainly was a pleasant room. I don't see how Uncle Jasper could have maintained such a gloomy disposition as he did, working all day in a room like this. The very sight of that open field out there makes me want to run and shout, and that window. Oh, who could look at it all day long and be CNLSTY and sour?" "But he had the shutter over the window," Sawa reminded her. "Yes, he did, "The poor man," said Nyoda in a tone of pity. She whisked about the room, straightening out nicks and wiping the dust from the furniture, and soon announced that she was ready to begin investigations. She looked carefully through the desk first, through old account books and files of papers and bills, but came upon nothing that touched upon repairs made to the house. There was a long bookcase running the entire length of one wall, and she tackled this next, while the Winnebagos sat around expectantly and Sylvia looked on from her chair, which she could move herself from place to place, to her infinite delight. The boys had gone downstairs with Sherry to hear reminiscences from across. All three boys worshipped Shenny like a god. To have been across, to have seen actual fighting, to have been sighted for bravely, and finally to have been shipwrecked, were experiences for which the younger boys would have given their ears, and they treated Shen Wai with a deferential respect that actually embarrassed him at times. Nyoda opened the bookcase and began taking out the books that crowded the shelves, opening them one by one and examining their contents. Most of them were works on history, some of them Uncle Jasper's own, great solid-looking volumes with fine print and dingy leather bindings. Ancient history, nearly all of them, and nowhere among them anything so modern as to concern Carver House. "What a collection of dry-as-dust works to have for your most intimate reading matter," exclaimed Nyoda, making a wry face at the books. "Not a single book or verse, not a single romance or book of fiction, not the ghost of a love story. There are plenty of them downstairs in the library, that belong to Uncle Jasper's father and mother, who must have had quite a lively taste in reading, judging from the books down there, but Hercules told me that Uncle Jasper hadn't opened the cases down there for 25 years. He never read anything but this ancient stuff up here. He did write one book that had some life in it, though," she continued musingly. "That was a story of the life of Elizabeth Carver, his great-grandmother, the one whose portrait hangs downstairs over the harp in the drawing-room. He's got all her various love affairs in it, and it's anything but dry. I sat up a whole night reading it the time I came across it in the library down below. But from the date of its publishing, Uncle Jasper must have been a very young man when he wrote it, probably before the ancient Hist 01Y spider bit him. And before the shutter went up," added Sawa. "Well," said Nyoda, after she had peeped into nearly every book in the bookcase, "there doesn't seem to be anything here more modern than the fall of Rome, and that's still several seasons behind the affairs of Carver House. Hello, what's this?" she suddenly exclaimed, holding up a book she had just picked up, one that had fallen down behind the others on the shelf. It was a fat, ledger-like volume heavily bound in calfskin. There was no title printed on the back of it, and Nyoda opened the cover. Two TNLLY terrifying figures greeted her eyes, drawn in India ink on the yellowed page, figures of two pirates with fiercely bristling mustachios, and brandishing scimitars half as large as themselves. Nyoda quite jumped, their attitude was so menacing. Under one was printed in red ink, Tad the Terror, and under the other Jasper the Feed. Underneath the two figures was printed in sprawling capitals, "Dri of Jasper M. Carver, Esquire." Nyoda gave a little shriek of laughter and held it up for the Winnebagos to see. "It must be Uncle Jasper's diary when he was a boy," she said. "His youthful idea of a man is a rather bloodthirsty one, according to the portrait, I must say. I suppose Jasper the Feed is supposed to be Uncle Jasper. His mustachios bristle more fiercely than the others, and his scimitar is longer, so without doubt he was the artist." Her eyes ran down the pages following, glancing at the lines of writing, which, having apparently been done in India ink, were still black, although the page on which they were written was yellow with age. As she read, her eyes began to sparkle with interest and enjoyment. "Oh girls," she exclaimed, "this is the best thing I've read in ages. Sure, and the boys must see it. I have to go and get lunch started now, but all of you come together after lunch and I'll read it out loud to you." "We'll all help," said Migwan, "and then we'll get through faster." And the Winnebagos hurried downstairs in Nyoda's wake. Chapter 6. Uncle Jasper's Diary. After lunch the Winnebagos and the boys gathered around Nyoda in Uncle Jasper's study to hear her read aloud from the diary of Jasper M. Carver, Esquire. She held the book up that all might see the portraits of the fearsome pirates, and then turned over to the next page, where the sprawly, uneven writing began, and started to read. The 7th of October, 1870. Confined to the house through bad behavior while father and mother have gone to the fair. I wasn't lonesome though because I had company. A boy ran into the yard chasing a cat and saw me sticking my head out of the upstairs window and blew a bean shooter at me and hit me on the chin, and I hit him with an apple core, and then he dared me to come out and lick him, but I couldn't go out of the house, so I dared him to climb up the porch post and come in the window. He came and I licked him. He is a new boy in town and his name is Sidney Phillips, but he wants to be called Tad. He lives up on Harrison Hill. We are going to be pirates when we grow up. I am going to be Jasper the Feed and he is going to be Tad the Terror. We swore eternal friendship and wrote our names in blood on the attic window sill. 011, how delicious, cried Sawa at the end of the first entry. Your uncle must have been lots of fun when he was young. What crazy things boys are, anyway. To start out by fighting each other and end up by swearing eternal friendship. Go on, Nyoda, what did they do next? Nyoda proceeded. November 1870. Tad and I made a great discovery this afternoon. There is a secret passage in this house. The concerted shriek of triumph that went up from the Winnebagos forced Nyoda to pause. "El told you there was," shouted Sawa above the rest. "Please hurry and read where it is, I can't wait another minute." Nyoda thumbed the page and then paused. "The next page is torn out," she said, holding the book up so they could all see the ragged strip of paper left hanging in the binding, where the page had been torn out. 011, what a shame. The wail rose on every side. "Maybe it tells later," said Sawa hopefully. "Go on, Nyoda." The diary continued on a page numbered 6. January 4, 1871. Tad and I played pirate today. We made a pirate's den in the secret passage. We are going to hide our chests of money there, all pieces of 8. We haven't any pieces of 8 yet, just some red, white and blue dollars we found in the desk drawer in the library. Tad thinks maybe they are patriotic currency they used in the revolution. Nyoda had to wait a minute until Sherry had got done laughing, and then she proceeded, the 19th of February, 1871. I am in durance vile, being locked in my room for a week with nothing to eat but bread and water because I shut Patricia up in the secret passage and went away and forgot all about her because there was a fire. I remembered and let her out as soon as I got home, but she had fainted, being a silly girl and afraid of the dark, and she couldn't scream because we tied a handkerchief over her mouth when we kidnapped her, being pirates. So now I am in Dunansville and cannot see any of my family, not even Tad. But he stands behind the hedge and shoots pieces of candy through my window with the bean shooter and lightens my Duransville, which is what a sworn friend has to do when their names are written in blood on the attic window sill. Thus the entries in the scrawling, boyish hand-covered page after page, recounting the adventurous and oft-times seamy career of the two youthful pirates, dire all of which the two stood up for each other stanchly, and never gave each other away, because they were sworn friends till death us do part, and their names were written in blood on the attic window sill. The entries became farther apart after a while, and the spelling improved until finally there came this announcement: Tad and I can't be pirates any longer. We are going to college next week. There the India ink ceased and also the illustrations. After that came page after page of neat entries in faded but still legible blue ink, telling of the progress through college of the two boys, chronicles of the joys, the troubles, the triumphs and the escapades of the two friends, still so inseparable that their names have become a byword among the students and they go by the nickname of David and Jonathan. When one of them gets into trouble, the other one still does what a swim friend has to do when their names are written in blood on the attic window sill. The Winnebagos listened with shining eyes while Nyoda read the tale of this remarkable friendship. The dates of the entries moved forward by months, records of scrapes became fewer and fewer, David and Jonathan had outgrown their colthood and were beginning to win honours with brain and brawn. Then came the record of their graduation and return to Oakwood, of Tad the Terror becoming a doctor, of the marriage of Jasper's sister Patricia to a sea captain, the death of his father and the passing of Carver House into his possession. Later came the account of a delightful year spent abroad with Tad Phillips, of mountain climbing in the Alps, of browsing among rare old art treasures in France and Italy, of gay larks in Paris. It was always he and Tad, still as loyal to each other as in the days when they wrote their names in blood on the attic window sill. After the entry which chronicled Jasper's return to Oakland and settling down in Carver House with his mother, and his enthusiastic adoption of literature as a profession, came an item which made the Winnebagos sit up and listen. It was the 3rd of June, 1885. I have had a new window put into my study on the side which faces towards Tad's house on Harrisburg Hill. I had the young Italian artist, Pusini, who has lately come to New York, come and set the glass for me. It is a representation of a charming scene I came across in Italy, an arched gateway covered over with climbing roses. The window is arranged so that through the arch of the gateway I can look directly at Tad's house. It gives me inspiration in my work. What a beautiful idea, said Himpaha, carried away completely by the great love of Jasper Carver for his friend, so simply expressed in his diary. So that was Tad's house, that we are living in, said Sylvia excitedly. I wonder where he is now. Go on reading, Nyoda said Sawa, consumed with interest in the tale. See if he says anything about the shutter. Nyoda passed on to the next entry. The 27th of June, 1885. Went to the Academy of Music in Philadelphia to hear Sylvia Warrington sing. She is the new singer from the South that has created such a furore. The Virginia Nightingale, they call her. What a God-gifted woman she is. There never was such a voice as hers. She sang "Hark, hark," the lark, and the whole house rose to its feet. She was spring incarnate. Sylvia Warrington. The name itself is music. I cannot forget her. She is like a lark singing in the desert at dawning. A vague remembrance leaped up for an instant in Katherine's mind and died as it came. Nyoda read on through pages that recorded Uncle Jasper's meeting with Sylvia Warrington, his great and growing love for her, his persistent wooing, her consenting to marry him, his wild happiness, which found vent in page after page of rapturous plans for the future. Then came the announcement of Tad's return from a period of study abroad, and Uncle Jasper's proud presentation of his bride-to-be. After that Tad's name appeared in connection with every occasion, still the faithful David to his beloved Jonathan. Then, almost without warning, the great friendship ran on the rocks and was shattered. For Tad no sooner saw Sylvia Warrington than he too fell madly in love with her. A brief and bitter entry told how she finally broke her engagement to Uncle Jasper and married Tad, and how Uncle Jasper, beside himself with grief and disappointment, turned against his friend and hated him with the undying hate that is born of jealousy. With heavy strokes of the pen that cut the paper he wrote down his determination to have no more friends and to live to himself thereafter. Then, in a shaky hand in marked contrast to the fierce strokes just above, he wrote, "But Sylvia, I love her still. I can't help it." That shaky handwriting stood as a mute testimonial to his heart's torment, and Nyoda, reading it after all these years, felt a sympathetic spasm of pain pass through her own heart at the sight of that wavering entry. "It's just like a stow in a book," exclaimed Himpaha, furtively drying her eyes, which had overflowed during the reading of the last page. The beautiful lady, and the rival lovers, and the disappointed one never marrying. Oh, it's too romantic for anything. Oh, please hurry and read what comes next. Nyoda turned the page and read the brief entry. "I have taken up the study of ancient history as a serious pursuit. In it I hope to find forgetfulness." The eyes of the Winnebagos travelled to the bookcase, and now they knew why there was nothing there but dull old books in heavy bindings, and why Uncle Jasper Carver hated love stories. The next entry had them all sitting up again. "I have had Hercules fasten an iron shutter over the window in my study, the one through which I can see Tad's house when I sit at my desk. I cannot bear to look at anything that reminds me of him." "There!" shouted all the Winnebagos at once. That was the reason for putting up the iron shutter. The missed one why is solved. "Poor Uncle Jasper," said Nyoda pityingly. "What a Spartan he was! How thoroughly he set about removing every memory of Tad from his mind. Think of covering up that beautiful pane of glass because he couldn't bear to look through it at the house of his friend." She finished reading the entry. Hercules demurred at covering up the window. He admired it more than anything else in the house, so to give him a satisfactory reason for doing so I told him the devil would come in through that gateway someday and I was putting up the shutter to keep him out. There's one thing sure, Hercules will never take that shutter down as long as he lives. He's scared nearly into a Chinaman. So that's why Hercules threw such a fit when we took the shutter off," said Sherry. "He thought that now the devil would come in and get him. Poor, superstitious old nigger." "I'll wonder if Tad and Sylvia went to live in the house on Harrisburg Hill," said Sawa curiously. "He doesn't say whether they did or not." "I wonder if they did," cried Sylvia, with eager interest. "To think I've been living in the same house they lived in, if they did live there," she added. "But how strange it seems to hear them call that place Harrisburg Hill. It is called Main Street Hill now. I'll wonder what Tad and Sylvia did after they were married," said Himpaha, with romantic curiosity. "Did they stay in Oakwood, or did they go away? Is there any more, Nyoda?" Nyoda was already glancing down the next page, which was written over with lines in blacker ink, and broader and heavier strokes of the pen, which seemed somehow to express grim satisfaction on the part of Uncle Jasper. Grim satisfaction Uncle Jasper must indeed have felt when he wrote those lines, for misfortune had overtaken the one who had caused his own anguish of heart. The int told how Tad had become staff physician at one of the large army posts in the West. There was an epidemic of typhoid and quite a few of the men were ill at once, all requiring the same kind of medicine. Through carelessness in making up a certain medicine he put in a deadly poison instead of the harmless ingredient he intended to put in, and a dozen men died of the dose. There was a tremendous stir about the matter, and the newspapers all over the country were full of it. He was court-martialed, and though he was acquitted, the mistake being entirely accidental, the matter had gained such publicity that his career as a doctor was enlined. He left the army and fled out of the country, taking Sylvia with him. Some months later the papers brought the announcement of both their deaths from yellow fever in Cuba. Again the handwriting began to waver on the last sentence. "She's dead." In those three little words the Winnebagos seemed to hear the echo of the breaking of a strong man's heart. There were no more entries. "Isn't it perfectly thrilling?" gulped Himpaha, with eyes overflowing again. "It's better than any book I ever read. And to think we never suspected there was anything like that connected with your Uncle Jasper. There, now, Katherine Adams, what did I tell you? You said he was a born bachelor, and just look at the romance he had." "He certainly did," said Katherine, in a tone of surrender. "That must be why the house we lived in was shut up so long," said Sylvia musingly. "The man that said we could live in it said that old Mrs. Phillips had moved away many years ago and had never come back, and although people knew she was dead, no one had ever come to live in the house, and nobody in Oakwood knew who owned it. The man said he had heard from older people in the town that Mrs. Phillips had had a son who was away from home all the time after he was grown up and who had gotten into some kind of trouble. He couldn't remember what it was. This must have been it. How queer it is, that I should first come to live in Tad's house, and then stay in the house of his friend. I never dreamed, when I heard that man telling Aunt Aggie about the almost forgotten people that used to live in the old house, that I should ever hear of them again. Things have turned out to be so interesting since I came to stay in the Winter Palace, she finished up with sparkling eyes. Darkness had fallen by the time Nyoda had finished reading Uncle Jasper's diary, and she jumped up with a little exclamation as the clock on the mantelpiece chimed 6. The other hours had struck unnoticed. "Mercy," she cried, "it's time dinner was on the table, and here we haven't even begun to get it. I forgot all about dinner, thinking about poor Uncle Jasper." All the rest had forgotten about dinner, too, and the Winnebagos could not get their minds off the tale they had just heard read. "Poor Uncle Jasper," they all said, looking up at his picture, and to their pitying eyes his face was no longer grim and stern, but only pathetic. Chapter 7. Sylvia's story. "Katherine Adams, whatever has happened to you?" asked Gladys suddenly, meeting her under the bright light in the hall that evening after dinner. "Why?" asked Katherine, looking startled. "Is there any soot on my face?" "No," replied Gladys with a peal of laughter, "I didn't mean anything like that. I meant that you look different from the way you used to look, that's all. You've changed since the days when I first knew you. What have you done to yourself in the last year? You're the same old Katherine, of course, but you're different, somehow. I noticed it when you first came to Brownell last fall, but I've been too busy to give it much thought. But since we've been here I've been watching you and I can't help noticing the difference. Now stand right there under that light and let me look at you." Katherine laughed good-humouredly and stood still dutifully while Gladys inspected her with appraising eyes that took in all the little improvements in Katherine's appearance. She was heavier than she used to be, some of her angles were softened into curves. She now stood erect, with her head up and her shoulders thrown back, which made her look several inches taller. Her hair no longer hung about her face in stringy wisps, the loose ends were curled becomingly around her temples and ears and held in place with invisible hairpins. She wore a trim worsted dress of an odd shade of blue, which was just the right shade to go with her dull blonde hair and with the dark brown of her neat shoes. Her knuckles were no longer red and rough, her fingernails were manicured, the sagging spectacles of the old days had given way to intellectual-looking nose glasses with narrow tortoise-shell rims. "Well, what's the verdict?" asked Katherine, smiling broadly at Gladys. "You're wonderful," said Gladys enthusiastically. "You're actually stunning. Whoever told you to get that particular shade of blue to bring out the color of your hair?" "Nobody told me," answered Katherine. "Elle bought it because it was a bargain." But there was a knowing twinkle in her eyes which gave her dead away, and Gladys, seeing it, knew that Katherine had at last achieved that pride of appearance which she had struggled so long to instill into her. "However did you do it?" she murmured. "It was your 11 rules of neatness that did it," replied Katherine, laughing. "Was it 7? I forget. But I did do just the things you told me to do, and it worked. There is no longer any danger of my coming apart in public. What a trial I used to be to you, though," she said, flushing a little at the recollection. "How you ever put up with me I don't know. How did you stand it, anyway?" "Because we loved you, sweet child," replied Gladys fondly, "and because we all believed the motto, while there's life, there's hope. We knew you would be a paragon of neatness someday as soon as you got around to it. You never could think of more than one thing at a time, Katherine dear." Oh my, look at them hugging each other," exclaimed a teasing voice from above. Looking up they saw Justice Dalrymple leaning over the banisters at the head of the stairs. "You never do that to me," he continued in a plaintive tone. Katherine and Gladys merely laughed at him and walked on, arm in arm, and Justice came down the stairs wringing mock tears out of his handkerchief and singing mournfully, "Forsaken, forsaken, forsaken am I, like the bones at a banquet all men pass me by." "Do behave yourself," Justice said Katherine with mock severity. If you disgrace me, I'll never get you invited anywhere again. Why can't you be good like the other two boys? "'Cause I'm a Junebug," warbled Justice, to the tune of "I'm a pilgrim 'cause I'm a Junebug, and I'm a beetle, and I can't be no rhinoceros, 'cause I'm a Junebug, and I'm a beetle, I can't be no rhinoceros." He advanced into the drawing room, where Katherine now stood alone, and drew out the last syllable of his absurd song into a long bleating wail that sent her into convulsions of laughter till the tears rolled down her cheeks. "Tears, idle tears," began Justice, picking up a vase from the table and holding it under her eyes, and then he stopped, as if struck by a sudden recollection. "I said that to you once before," he said, "don't you remember? The first time we really got acquainted with each other. You were standing by the stove, weeping into the apple sauce." "It was pudding," Katherine corrected him, with a little shamefaced laugh at the remembrance, "huckleberry pudding. And I streaked it all over my face and you nearly died laughing." "Well, you laughed too," Justice defended himself, "and that's how we got to be friends." "That seems ages ago," said Katherine, "and yet it's only a little over a year." What a year that was! Both stopped their bantering and looked at each other with sober eyes, each thinking of what the trying year at Spencer had been to them. Justice's eyes travelled over Katherine, and he, too, noticed that she was much better looking than when he first knew her. Katherine noticed the admiration dawning in his eyes and divined his thoughts. After Gladys's spontaneous outburst of approval, she knew beyond any doubt that her appearance no longer offended the artistic eye. The knowledge gave her a new confidence in herself, and a thrill of pleasure that she had never experienced before went through her like an electric shock. At last people had ceased to look upon her as a cross between a circus and a lunatic asylum, she told herself exultingly. "Well, what are you thinking about?" she asked finally, as Justice continued silent. "I was just thinking," replied Justice gravely, "about the difference in plumage that different climates bring about." "Whatever made you think about birds?" asked Katherine wonderingly. "You jump from one subject to another like a flea. I don't see how you can keep your mind on your work long enough to invent anything. By the way, how is that gummy of yours going? You re as mum as an oyster about it." "Pretty well," replied Justice. "I'm hampered though, by not having the right kind of help, and not being able to get some of the things I need." Katherine looked at him scrutinizingly. He looked tired and rather worn. The nonsensical boy had vanished and a man stood in his place, a man with a heavy responsibility on his shoulders. Justice had that way of changing all in an instant from a boy to a man. At times he would go frolicking about the house till you would have sworn he was not a day older than Slim and the captain, an instant later he was all gravity, and looked every day of his 26 years. Katherine always stood in awe of him whenever that change took place. He seemed so old and wise and experienced then that she felt hopelessly ignorant and childish beside him. She liked him best when he seemed like the other boys. "What do you think of my Winnebagos?" she asked him, leading him away from the subject of his work. He always got old looking when he talked about it. "Greatest bunch of girls I ever saw," he replied heartily. "Never came across such an accomplished lot in all my life. Each one's more fun than the next. Himpaha's a beauty, and Gladys is a dainty fairy, and Sawa looks like a brown THNLSH, and Migwan's a regular Madonna. And, say, would you mind telling me how you do it, anyway?" "Do what?" "Stick together like that. I thought girls always squabbled among themselves. I never thought they could do things together the way you girls do." "Campfire girls can do things together," Katherine informed him with emphasis. "You boys think you're the only ones that know anything about teamwork. Teamwork is our first motto. I guess it must be," admitted Justice. "You certainly are a team." The rest of the team came in then, Sawa and Gladys and Himpaha, all three arm in arm, and Migwan behind them, pushing Sylvia in her rolling chair. They settled in a circle before the fireplace, and the talk soon drifted around to Uncle Jasper and his blighted romance. Indeed, Himpaha had done nothing but talk about it all during dinner. Sylvia, too, was completely taken up with it. "I'll love Sylvia Warrington," she exclaimed fervently. "I'm going to have her for my beloved. I'm glad she had black hair. I adore black hair. And I'm so glad my name is Sylvia, too. I've been pretending that she was my aunt, and that I was named after her. I've been pretending, too, that she taught me to sing, 'Hark, hark, the lark.' Now, when I sing it I always think of her." Wasn't it beautiful, what Uncle Jasper said about her? "She's like a lark, singing in the desert at dawning. Oh, I can see it all, the desert, and the sun coming up, and the lark soaring up and singing. I just can't breathe, it's so beautiful. And my beloved is like that." A radiant dream light came into her eyes, and she seemed suddenly to have travelled far away from the group by the fire and to be wandering in some far-off land. "Sylvia is a beautiful name," said Katherine. "For whom are you called? Was your mother's name Sylvia?" It was the first time any of them had spoken of Sylvia's mother, who they knew must be dead. Sylvia's eyes lost their dreaminess and she looked up with a merry smile. "I'll made it up myself," she said. "I'll don't know what my first real name was, but when Aunt Aggie got me she named me Aggie, after herself. But Aggie is such a hopelessly unimaginative sort of name. It doesn't make you think of a thing when you say it. You might just as well be named Empty as Aggie. Then once we lived in the same house with a lady who sang, and she used to sing, 'Who is Sylvia?' It was the most tuneful name I'd ever heard, and I wondered and wondered who Sylvia was. But I guess the lady never found out, because she kept right on singing, 'Who is Sylvia?' So one day I said to myself, I'll be Sylvia. Don't you think it's a fragrant name? When I say it I can see festoons of pink rosebuds tied with baby ribbon. I made people call me Sylvia, and that's been my name ever since." 011, "You funny child," said Nyoda, joining in the general laugh at Sylvia's tale of her name. "But Sylvia," said Sawa wonderingly, "you said you didn't know what your first real name was before you came to live with your aunt. Didn't your aunt know it?" "No," replied Sylvia. "You see," she continued, "Aunt Aggie isn't my real aunt. She adopted me when I was a baby." "Oh," said the Winnebagos in surprise. "But why do you call her aunt?" asked Sawa. "Why don't you call her mother?" "She never would have it," replied Sylvia. "She always taught me to call her Aunt Aggie. I don't know why." Sylvia moved restlessly in her chair, and from the folds of the loose dressing gown which she wore a picture tumbled out. Katherine picked it up and laid it back on her lap. It was a small coloured poster sketch of a red-haired girl in a golf cape, which had evidently been the cover design of a magazine some years ago. "Why are you so fond of that poster, Sylvia?" asked Katherine curiously. "You brought it along with you when you came here, and you keep it with you all the time?" Sylvia's tone when she answered was half humorous and half wistful. "That's my mother," she said. "Your mother?" exclaimed Katherine, incredulously. "Not my really real mother," Sylvia continued quickly. "Elle never saw a picture of her. But Aunt Aggie said my mother had red hair and was most uncommonly good-looking, so I found a picture of a beautiful lady with red hair and called it my mother. It's better than nothing." The Winnebagos nodded silently and no one spoke for a moment. Then Katherine asked gently, "What else do you know about Mother?" Sylvia sat up and related the tale told her hundreds of times by Aunt Aggie, in answer to her eager questioning about her mother. Unconsciously she used Aunt Aggie's expressions and gestures as she told it. And Joe was coming on the steam cars from Butler to Philadelphia, and in back of us sat a young couple with a baby about a month old. The girl, she wasn't nothing but a girl even though she was a married woman, was most uncommon good-looking. She had bright red hair and big grey eyes, and she wore a golf cape. Her husband was a big, red-faced fella, homely but real honest looking. They weren't either of them 20 years old. Farmers, I could tell from their talk, and as well as I could make out, the name on their bag was Mitchell. Well, along between Waterloo and Poland there suddenly come a terrible bump, and then a smash and a crash, and the next thing I was laying under the seat and Joe was trying to pull me out. When I did finally get out, the car was laying over on its side all smashed to bits. Somehow or other when Joe dug me out from under the seat I had a hold of the little baby that had been in the seat in back of me. The young man and woman were under the wreck. They were both killed, but the baby never had a scratch. Nobody ever found out who the red-headed woman and the man were, because they were all burned up in the wreck, and all their luggage. Elle had taken care of the baby, thinking I'd keep her until her people were found, but they were never heard from, so I decided to keep her for my own. That baby was you, Sylvia. So that's all I know about my mother and father, finished Sylvia with a sigh. But I can think up the most dazzling things about them. Sylvia, said Katherine, who was the man I saw on the stairs of your house the night I came in and found you? Sylvia looked at her in wonder. What man? When I came into the hall there was a man leaning over the banisters about halfway up the stairs. When I came in he ran down the stairs and out of the front door. I can't imagine, said Sylvia. No man ever came to the house to see us. I didn't hear anybody come in that day. But the front door stood open when I came up on the porch, said Katherine. That hadn't been standing open all day, had it? No, replied Sylvia, for Aunt Aggie was always careful about closing it when she went out. Then he must have opened it, said Katherine. How queer, said Sylvia. What do you suppose he could have been doing there? He never knocked on the inside door. Possibly he thought the house was empty, and went in to get out of the cold, concluded Katherine. Then he heard you singing, and it scared him. He looked frightened out of his wits when I saw him. When I came in he just ran for his life. Katherine laughed as she remembered her own dismay at seeing the man and thinking that he was the owner of the house, when he was only a stray visitor himself and worse frightened than she. Here she had prepared such an elaborate apology in her mind, and he was nothing but a tramp. The humour of it struck her forcibly, now that it was all in the past, and she laughed over it most of the evening. About 9 o'clock Hercules came shuffling in, suffering from a bad cold, and asked Nyoda to give him something for it. While Nyoda went upstairs to the medicine chest, Sawa craftily asked the old man, Hercules, did you ever hear of there being a secret passage in this house? Hercules gave a visible start. Before you ask that, he demanded. 011, for no special reason, said Sawa casually. Elle just thought maybe there was one and that you might know about it. There always is one in these old houses, you know. Well, dear, ain't in dis, answered the old man vehemently, and at the same time looking relieved. Mas Jasper he always used to say to me, Hercules he used to say, dear's one good thing about dis house, and that is it ain't cluttered up with no secret passages. Secret passages am powerful unlucky, Miss Sawa. On't I knew a man that lived in a house that had a secret passage, and one night de ole debil got in thu that secret passage and NLN off with him. Don you go huntin' no secret passages, Miss Sawa, if you knows what's good for you. Day suddenly am powerful unlucky. Nyoda came downstairs and bore Hercules off to the kitchen, and the Winnebagos and the boys had their laugh out behind his back. How can he tell such fibs in such a truthful-sounding way, remarked Justice. If I didn't know about that passage from Uncle Jasper's diary I'd be inclined to believe every word he said. But I bet the old sinner knows all about it, just as Uncle Jasper did. Even if he doesn't, how can he invent such convincing speeches on the part of Uncle Jasper out of the empty air? He's the most engaging old fibber I ever came across. Nyoda came back and bore Sylvia off to bed, and then she returned to the library. "Sherry," she said thoughtfully, leaning her chin in her hand, "Dr. Crosby was here this morning to return those binoculars he borrowed the other day, and I talked to him about Sylvia. He said he had once been called in to treat her for tonsillitis when she lived in Millvale, and had examined her spine at the time. He said it was a splintered vertebra and it could be fixed by grafting in a piece of bone. They are doing wonders now that way. He said Dr. Gilbert, the famous specialist, could perform an operation that would cure her. He hadn't had a chance to talk it over with Sylvia's aunt because he had been called away suddenly, and when he returned to town the Deans were gone. He had no idea what had become of them. He only made a hasty examination, but he is positive she can be cured. I know the Deans can't afford to pay for such an operation, but Dr. Crosby said he was sure he could persuade Dr. Gilbert to perform it free, in his clinic. I told Dr. Crosby to bring Dr. Gilbert to Oakwood as soon as he could. He said he thought it would be possible soon. I thought as long as we are going to keep Sylvia in our care until her aunt is well again, we might as well have her fixed up in the meantime. I would like to have the operation over before her aunt knows anything about it, say the first week of the new year. What do you think?" "Phew," whistled Shen Wai, looking at his wife in astonishment. The rapidity with which Nyoda got a project underway was a 9 days wonder to Sherry, who usually spent more time in deliberating a course of action than she did in carrying it out. "Go ahead," was all he could say. The Winnebagos gave long exclamations of joy. It had never occurred to them that anything could be done for Sylvia. "Does she know it?" asked Himpaha. "Not yet," replied Nyoda. "Elle thought we would keep it for a birthday surprise. Her birthday is the 29th. Elle too have Dr. Gilbert come that day and let him tell her himself. Don't anybody mention it to her until then." "We won't," promised the Winnebagos, and trooped off to bed, heavy with their delicious secret. Chapter 8. The footprints on the stairs. The Winnebagos woke bright and early the next morning, eager to begin the search for the secret passage again, but whatever plans they had formed were driven entirely out of their minds by the appearance of the footprints on the stairs. Nyoda discovered them first when she raised the curtains on the stair landing on her way down to bring in the morning paper. The day before, in anticipation of the coming of the men from the second-hand store to remove the discarded furniture from Uncle Jasper's study, she had improvised a runner to cover the front stairs to keep them from being scratched. The stretch from the upstairs to the landing she had covered with a strip of rag carpet, and from the landing down she had used a length of white canvas. The landing itself was still bare, as she had not yet found the old rug she intended laying there. Now, as she came downstairs, she noticed, on the strip of white canvas that covered the bottom half of the stairs, 3 dark red footprints. On the white background they stood out with startling distinctness. They began on the 3rd step from the top and appeared on every other step from then on to the bottom. All 3 were the prints of a right foot. No heel marks were visible, only the upper half of the foot. From the direction which they pointed they were made by a person descending the stairs, and from their size that person was a man. Nyoda's first thought that Sherry had cut his foot and had gone downstairs, leaving a bloody trail on her sternulna, and full of concern she immediately sought him. But her search revealed him down in the basement, coaxing up the furnace, and there was nothing the matter with his feet. The captain was with him and he likewise disclaimed a cut foot. The 2 of them had come down the back stairs. Nyoda hurried back upstairs. Justice and Slim were in the upper hall when she came up, just in the act of coming down. "Good morning," they both called out in cheery greeting. "Which one of you has the cut foot?" she asked. "Cut foot? Not I," said Justice. "Nor I," said Slim. "Did somebody cut his foot?" "Look," said Nyoda, pointing to the marks on the lower steps. "It must have been your husband, or the captain," said Justice. "It wasn't either of us." "It wasn't either of them," replied Nyoda. "I asked them. They are down in the basement fussing with the furnace." "It's the print of a foot with a shoe on," said Justice, examining the marks. "Somebody must have gotten into the house last night," exclaimed Nyoda in a startled tone. "Sherry," she called, "come up here." Sherry came up from the basement on the run, for he recognized something out of the ordinary in his wife's tone, and the captain came hard on his heels. The girls came ilning down from above to see what the commotion was about, and the whole household stood staring at the mysterious footprints in startled bewilderment. "Burglars!" cried Hildegard with a little shriek. 011, my silverware, exclaimed Nyoda in a stricken tone, and raced into the dining room. She pulled open the sideboard drawers with trembling hands, expecting to find them ransacked, but nothing was amiss. Why peace was still in its place. Neither had the sterling silver candlesticks on top of the sideboard been disturbed. A thorough search through the house revealed nothing missing. Various gold bracelets and watches lay in plain sight on dressers, and Hildegard's gold mesh bag hung on the back of a chair beside her bed. Sherry reported no money gone. Nothing stolen. Who had entered the house then, if not a burglar? The thing had resolved itself into a mystery, and everyone looked at his neighbor with puzzled eyes. Breakfast was completely forgotten. "What gets me," said Sherry, "where those footprints started from. By the way they point, the man was going downstairs, but they begin in the middle of the stairway. Clearly he didn't start at the top. Do you suppose he came in through the landing window?" He examined the triple window on the landing closely, but soon looked around with a puzzled expression on his face. "The windows are all fastened from the inside," he reported, "and there's no sign of their having been tampered with. It doesn't look as though anyone could have come in this way." He examined all the rest of the windows on the first floor, and found them all latched and their latches undisturbed. The doors, too, were locked from the inside. The cellar windows had a heavy screening over them on the outside which could not be removed without being destroyed, and this screening was everywhere intact. "He must have come in through one of the upstairs windows after all," said Nyoda. There were about a dozen open in the various bedrooms. The window in the room Hildegard and Gladys sleep in is directly over the front porch. Hildegard and Gladys gave a simultaneous shriek at the thought of the mysterious intruder coming through their room while they lay sleeping. "But if he came down from upstairs, why aren't the footprints all the way down, instead of beginning in the middle?" insisted Katherine. "He couldn't have come down from upstairs, he must have come in through this window on the landing," she said decidedly, going up to the window and looking it over sharply for any sign of having been opened, and, by shaking the wooden framework of the little square panes vigorously, as if she would shake the truth out of it by force. The window, however, still yielded no sign of having been opened, and the sill outside bore no marks of an instrument. The mystery grew deeper. How could those footprints have started under the landing window if the feet that made them did not enter by that window? "Maybe he did come from upstairs after all," said Sawa, whose lively brain had been working hard on the puzzle, "but his foot didn't begin to bleed until he was halfway down. Maybe he hurt it on the landing. Sat down to trim his toenails and cut his toe off," probably suggested Justice, and the girls giggled hysterically. Striking an attitude in imitation of a storybook detective, Justice began to address the group. "Gentlemen of the jury," he began, "we have here a mystery which has baffled the brightest minds in the country, but unraveling it has been the merest child's play to a great detective like myself. Here are the facts in the case. A man goes down a stairway. The first half of his descent is shrouded in oblivion, halfway down he begins to leave bloody footprints. There is only one answer, gentlemen, the one which occurred to me immediately. It is this: upon reaching the landing the mysterious descender suddenly remembers that it is the day on which he annually trims his toenails. Being a very methodical man, as I can detect by the way his feet point when he goes downstairs, he sits down and does it then and there. But the knife slips and he cuts off his toe, after which he makes bloody footprints on the rest of the stairs. Justice Dalrymple, you awful boy, exclaimed Katherine, and then she laughed with the rest at his absurd explanation of the mystery. Well, can you think up any argument that disproves my theory? He retorted calmly. Elkin, replied the captain. If your theory was correct, we'd have found the toe lying on the stairs. The girls shrieked and covered their ears with their hands. The captain chuckled wickedly, but said no more. I can think up another argument, said Sawa. Your man went barefoot after he cut his toe off, but this one had his shoe on. So he did, admitted Justice. Now you've done up so my whole theory. But how could his foot bleed through his shoe? Asked Katherine skeptically. The sole must have been cut through, said Justice. He probably wore a rubber-soled shoe, like a sneaker, and stepped on some broken glass that went right through the sole into his foot. I did the same thing myself once. It bled through, all right. But what did he step on? Asked Nyoda, puzzled. There isn't any sign of broken glass around. I give it up, said Sherry, who could make nothing from the facts before him and had no imagination to help him supply missing details. The man undoubtedly got in through the upstairs window and out the same way. He was a burglar, only he got scared away before he could steal anything. Some noise in the house, probably. He must have heard Slim snoring, and thought it was a bombing plane coming after him, said Justice, and then dodged nimbly as Slim made a pass at his head with a menacing whatever he did to his foot fixed him, said Sherry. He called it a day when that happened and went off without making a haul. Probably had a pal outside in a machine. Nyoda, said Sawa, struck with a sudden thought. Do you think it could have been Hercules? He might have come in for something in the night. Of course, exclaimed Nyoda. Why didn't I think of that before? Hercules has a key to the back door. How idiotic of me not to have guessed before that it was Hercules. Here we stand looking at these footprints like Robinson Crusoe looking at Fridays, and talking about burglars, and racking our brains wondering where he came in, and it must have been Hercules all the while. He cut his foot and came in to get something for it, or he came in to get something more for his cold and cut his foot after he got in. Poor old Hercules. Hugh oldn't he even wake us up to get help. I'll go right out and find out what happened to him. She started for the back door, but before she had reached the kitchen there was a stamping of feet on the back doorstep, a tapping on the door, and then Hercules opened it himself and came in, as was his custom. Mornin', Miss Lisbeth, he quavered genially, smiling a broad, toothless smile at the sight of her. Mighty nippy dis mornin'. He shivered and stamped his feet on the floor, edging over toward the stove. Nyoda looked down at his feet hastily and instantly realized that it was not he who had left the print on the stairs. The loose, flapping felt slippers which Hercules invariably wore, bursting out on all sides, would have left a mark twice the size of the mysterious footprints. Nobody knew just how big Hercules' feet were. He owned to wearing a size 12, at which Sherry openly scoffed. I'll bet a size 15 could hurt him, he declared. The rest also saw at a glance that there was no possibility of Hercules having made the footprints. Hercules, unconscious of charged atmosphere of the house, looked around for the breakfast which should be set out for him on the end of the kitchen table at this hour. You all oversleep? He inquired good-temperedly of Nyoda. No, we didn't, replied Nyoda. We've had a little excitement this morning and forgot all about breakfast. Somebody got into the house last night. Burglars? Asked Hercules anxiously. Did anything get stole? No, replied Nyoda, nothing was stolen, but the burglar left some bloody footprints on the stair runner. We thought at first it might have been you, coming to get something for your cold, but I see now that it is impossible for you to have left the footprints. You didn't come into the house last night, did you? She finished. No, answered Hercules with simple directness. Done slip like a top, Miss Lisbeth. Took that hot drink you all gave me to take, and never woke up till the sun starts shining this mornin'. Feeling better now? Cold getting well? Feeling mighty hungry? His eye travelled speculatively toward the stove. There was absolutely no doubt about his telling the truth. When Hercules was trying to conceal something, his language was much more eloquent and flowery. "Your breakfast will be ready before long," said Nyoda kindly. Then, as Hercules hobbled toward the stove, she asked solicitously, "Have you a sore foot, Hercules?" "No," replied Hercules, "but the misery in my knees is powerful bad this mornin', Miss Lisbeth. Seems like my old jints is gettin' plumb rusted." He launched into a detailed description of the various pains caused by his misery until Nyoda sought refuge in the front pan of the house. She had heard the tale many times before. Pretty soon Hercules hobbled in and took a look at the footprints on the stairs. "Powerful singler," he said, scratching his head in a puzzled way. Sherry went on to explain all the details for the old man's benefit. "We thought at first he must have come in dire of the window on the stair landing, but that hadn't been touched, so decided he must have come in through one of the upstairs windows. It seems queer, though, that the footprints should have begun under the stair landing, doesn't it?" "What's the matter, Hercules? Are you sick?" asked Nyoda, looking at the old man in alarm. For Hercules' eyes were rolling wildly in his head and his legs threatened to collapse under him. He sat heavily down on a chair and began to rock to and fro, muttering to himself in a terrified way. Straining their ears to catch his words, they heard him say, "Debil's a coming, Debil's a coming, Debil's a coming," after old Hercules for taking that shutter down. Debil done left his footprint for a warning for old Hercules. He seemed beside himself with fright. Nyoda and Sherry looked at each other in perplexity. "What's the matter with him?" asked Nyoda, in a tone of concern. "Superstitious," replied Sherry reassuringly. "Negroes believe the devil is walking around on two legs, waiting to grab them from behind evilly fence. You remember Uncle Jasper mentioned in his diary that he told Jasper if he ever took that shutter down the devil would come in through the window and get him. Now he thinks it's happened. Don't be alarmed at him. Get him his breakfast, and that'll give him something else to think about." The Winnebagos hastened to set out his breakfast on the table, but he ate scarcely anything, and still trembled when he went back to his rooms in the coach house. "Funny old codger," commented Sherry, looking after him. "He's chock full of superstition. If he throws many more such fits, I suppose I'll have to nail up the old shutter again to keep him from dying of fright." "You'll do no such thing," replied Nyoda. "I'll have no more holes in that casement. Hercules will be all right again in a day or two. By that time he'll have a new bogey. Now everybody come to breakfast, and forget all about this miserable business." Chapter 9. The Trials of an Explorer. "Oh, tell me again about the time you went camping, and the people thought you were drowning," begged Sylvia. Himpaha drew up a footstool under her feet, and sank back into a cushioned chair with a long sigh of contentment. All day long she had been helping the others search for the secret passage, upstairs and downstairs, and back upstairs again, until she dropped, panting and exhausted, into a chair beside Sylvia in the library and declared she couldn't stand up another minute. The others never thought of stopping. "But you aren't fat," she retorted when Sawa protested against her dropping out. "You can run up and downstairs like a spider, no wonder you aren't tired." "I'm completely inside." "You're what?" "Completely inside." Classical English for all in. All in is slang, and we can't use slang in Nyoda's house, you know. Sawa snorted and returned to the search, which was now centered in Uncle Jasper's study. "Now tell me about your getting rescued," said Sylvia. "We were spending the weekend at Sylvan Lake," recounted Himpaha, "and there were campers all around. Sawa and I wanted to get an honor for upsetting a canoe and righting it again, so we put on our skirts and middies over our bathing suits and paddled out into deep water. Nyoda was watching us from the shore. We were going to take the complete test, upset the canoe, undress in deep water, right the canoe and paddle back to shore. We got out where the water was over our heads and upset the canoe with a fine splash. We were just coming up and beginning to pull off our middies, when we heard a yell from the shore. 2 young men from one of the cottages were tearing down to the beach like mad, throwing their coats into space as they ran. "Hold on, girls, we'll save you," they shouted across the water, and jumped in and swam out toward us. "Look what's coming," giggled Sylvia. "Oh, won't they be surprised when they see us right the canoe?" I sputtered as well as I could for laughing. "Come on, honey up." "What a shame to spoil their chance of being heroes," said Sylvia. "They may never have another chance. Let's let them tow us in." Sylvia went down underwater and did dead man's float, and it looked as though she had gone under. I followed her. But I laughed right out loud underwater and made the bubbles go up in a spout and had to go up for air. The 2 fellows were almost up to us. Sylvia threw up her hand and waved it wildly, and I began to laugh again. "Keep still and be saved like a lady," Sylvia hissed, and I straightened out my face just in time. The 2 fellows took hold of us and towed us to shore. People were lined up all along, watching, and they cheered and made a big fuss over those 2 fellows. We could see Nyoda and Migwan and Gladys running away with their handkerchiefs stuffed into their mouths. We lay on the beach a while, looking awfully limp and scared, and after a while we let somebody help us to our cottage, and you should have heard the hilarity after we were alone. We laughed for 2 hours without stopping. Nyoda insisted that we go and express our grateful thanks to 2 young men for saving our lives, and we managed to keep our faces straight long enough to do it, but the strain was awful. "Oh, what fun," cried Sylvia, laughing until the tears came, and then with an irresistible burst of longing she exclaimed, "Oh, if I could only do things like other girls." "You are going to do things like other girls," said Himpaha in the tone of one who knows a delightful secret. "You're going to walk again," Nyoda said. "The doctor said so." Sylvia's face went dead white for an instant, and then lighted up with that wonderful inner radiance that made her seem like a glowing lamp. "Amel," she gasped faintly, catching hold of Himpaha's arm with tense fingers. "You certainly are," said Himpaha, in a convincing tone. "Nyoda said you could be cured. The specialist is coming in a day or 2 to arrange the operation." "Oh dear, now I've told it," she exclaimed. "We were going to save it for a birthday surprise." "Oh," breathed Sylvia, and sank back in her chair, unable to say another word. Her eyes burned like stars. To walk again. Not to be a burden to Aunt Aggie. The sudden joy that surged through her nearly suffocated her. To walk. Perhaps to dance. The desire to dance had always been so strong in her that it sometimes seemed to her that she must die if she couldn't dance. All the joy that was coming to her world before her eyes in a wild kaleidoscope of shifting images. "Then I can be a campfire girl." "You're going to be a Winnebago." "Oh. You can go camping with us." "Oh. You will be a singer, and go on the stage, maybe." "Oh. Maybe you even." Himpaha's sentence was suddenly interrupted by a mighty uproar from the basement. First came a crash that rocked the house, followed by a series of lesser thumps and crashes, mingled with the racket of breaking glass. The Winnebagos, rushing out into the hall from Uncle Jasper's study, were brushed aside by Sherry and Justice and the captain, tearing down the attic stairs. Sherry snatched up his revolver from his dresser and went down the stairs 3 at a time, with the boys close at his heels. "The burglars are in the basement," came from the frightened lips of the girls as they crept fearfully down the stairs. All felt that the mystery of the footprints on the stairs was about to be cleared up. Sherry opened the cellar door and paused at the top. "Who's down there?" he called, in a voice of thunder. From somewhere below came a dismal wail. "Throw me a plank, somebody, I am drowning." "There's a tidal wave down it, Slim," cried Nyoda, recognizing his voice. "What's the matter?" she called. She and Sherry raced down the cellar stairs, with the Winnebagos and the two boys streaming after. They found Slim lying on the floor of the fruit cellar, nearly drowned in a pool of vinegar which was gushing over him from the wreck of a 200-gallon barrel lying beside him. Around him and on top of him lay the debris of a shelf of canned fruit. Sherry and the boys rescued him and finally succeeded in convincing him that he was not fatally injured. The stream of vinegar was diverted into a nearby drain, and Slim told his tale of woe. He had been down in the cellar looking for the secret passage. There was a place in the stone wall that sounded hollow when he struck it with a hammer, and he went around to see what was on the other side of that wall. It was the fruit cellar. While he was poking around in it, a big stone suddenly fell down out of the wall and smashed in the head of the barrel, which tipped over almost on top of him, and nearly drowned him in vinegar, while the jars of fillet came down all around him. "That loose stone in the wall," exclaimed Sherry. "I forgot to warn you boys about it when you were sounding the walls with hammers. It's a mighty good thing it fell on the barrel and not on you." He and Nyoda turned cold at the thought of what might have happened. But the sight of Slim, dripping with vinegar and covered with canned peaches, drove all thoughts of tragedy out of their minds, and the cellar resounded with peals of helpless laughter for the next 20 minutes. Justice tried to sweep up the broken glass, but sank weakly into a bin of potatoes and went from one convulsion into another, until the captain finally poured a dipper of water over him to calm him down. "Oh dear," gasped Justice, mopping his face with the end of a potato bag. If Uncle Jasper could only have seen what he started with that diary of his, it would have jolted him clean out of his melancholy. Chapter 10. The Secret Passage. "Oh, tell Aunt Aggie I think the Winter Palace is the most wonderful place in the whole world," cried Sylvia enthusiastically. "Tell her that the ladies-in-waiting are the dearest that ever lived, and the 3 court jesters are the funniest. Tell her I'm so happy I feel as though I were going to burst. And be sure and tell her that I'm going to get well." Sylvia had not been able to conceal her rapture for a minute after Himpaha had told her the news the day before. They all knew she knew it, and when they saw her rapture they did not scold Himpaha for letting the cat out of the bag before the time set. To have given her those 2 extra days of happiness was worth the sacrifice of their surprise. All morning she had filled the house with her song and chatted happily of the time when she would go camping with the Winnebagos. "We've made more plans than we can carry out in 100 years, she told Nyoda gleefully. "Oh, please live that long, so you can help us do all we've planned." Nyoda smiled back into the starry eyes, and promised faithfully to live forever, if need be, to accommodate her. "I'll give Aunt Aggie all your messages," she said now, stopping in the act of drawing on her gloves to pat the shining head. "You're so good to go and see Aunt Aggie." Nyoda patted her on the head again and then started cityward with her big box of delicacies for Mrs. Dean. With her went Migwan and Gladys and Himpaha, who wanted to do some shopping in the city. Sawa and Katherine refused to give up their search for the passage even for one afternoon. Sawa had an idea that possibly there was a secret door in the back of one of the built-in bookcases in the library, and had Nyoshia's permission to take out all the books and look. Justice and Slim and the captain had promised to help take out the books. Sylvia was wheeled into the library where she could watch the proceedings, and the work of removing the books began. Sherry looked on for a while and then went out to tinker with the car. Section by section they took the books from the cases and examined the wall behind them, but it was apparently solid. Sawa and the captain worked faithfully, taking out the books and replacing them, but Katherine would stop to read, and Slim soon fell asleep with his head against the seat of a chair. Justice spied Slim after a while and began to throw magazines at him. Slim wakened with an indignant grunt and returned the volley, and then the two engaged in a good-natured wrestling bout. "I'll know a new trick," said Justice. "It's for handling a fellow twice your size. A Japanese fellow down in Washington taught it to me. Let me practice it on you. will you? You're the first one I've seen since I limed it who was so much heavier than Slim consented amiably enough, and Justice proceeded with a series of operations that rolled his big antagonist around on the floor like a meal sack. Don't make so much noise, boys, commanded Katherine, putting a warning finger to her lips. Don't you see that Sylvia has fallen asleep? Go on out into the hall and do your wrestling tricks out there. Slim and Justice removed themselves to the hall and continued their wrestling, and the captain abandoned the books to watch them and cheer them on. Bet you can't back him all the way up the stairway, said the captain, as Justice forced Slim up the first step. Bet I can, replied Justice, and then began a terrific struggle, science against bulk. Slim fought every inch of the way, but, nevertheless, went up steadily, step by step. Sawa and Katherine, drawn by the captain's admiring exclamations at Justice's feat, also abandoned the books and came out to watch. Justice got Slim as far as the landing, and there Slim got his arms wound around the stair post and anchored himself effectively. One step above the landing was as far as Justice could get him. Justice leaned over him and tried another trick to break his grip on the post, and the two were seesawing back and F01th when suddenly the captain gave a yell that made Justice loosen his hold on Slim and ask in a scared voice, "What's the matter?" "The landing," gasped the captain. "Look at the landing." Justice looked, and the others looked, and they all stood speechless with amazement, for the stair landing was doing something that they had never in all their bomb days seen a stair landing do before. It was sliding out of its place, sliding out over the bottom flight of stairs as smoothly and silently as though on oiled wheels. The five stood still and blinked stupidly at the phenomenon, unable to believe their eyes. The landing came out until there was a gap of about 2 feet between it and the wall, and then noiselessly came to a stop. In the opening thus made they could see the top of an iron ladder set upright against the wall below. Sawa rallied her stunned senses first. "The secret passage," she cried triumphantly. "Daggers and dirks," exclaimed the captain. "What made it open up?" asked Katherine curiously. "Is the spring that works it?" Justice and the captain shook their heads. "Where the post," exclaimed Slim, mopping the perspiration from his brow. "I was pulling at it for dear life when all of a sudden something clicked inside of it." Then the captain yelled that the stair landing was coming out. "The spring that works it is in the landing post." Slim reached out and tugged away at the post again, but nothing happened. Then he got hold of the carved head and began to twist it, and it hummed under his hands. There was a click, faint, but audible to the eagerly listening ears, and the landing began to slide smoothly back into place. In a moment the opening was closed, and the landing was apparently a solid piece of carpentry. "Whoever invented that was a genius," exclaimed Justice in admiration. "And all the while we were trying to find a secret passage through the walls by tapping on the panels. If it hadn't been for Slim we could have spent all the rest of our lives looking for it and never would have found it, for we never in all the wide world would have thought of twisting the head of that stair post. Slim, you weren't born in vain after all. See if you can make it open up again," said Sawa. Slim twisted the head of the post, and presently there came the now familiar click and the floor slid out with uncanny quietness. "Let's go down," said the captain, going to the edge of the opening and looking in. "What's down there?" asked Katherine. "Nothing but space," replied the captain, straining his eyes to peer into the darkness. "At least that's all I can see from here. Give me your flashlight, Slim, I'm going down." Slim handed him his pocket flash and the captain began to descend the ladder. He counted 12 rungs before he felt solid footing under him. He found himself in a tiny room about 6 feet square, whose walls and floor were of stone. The top was open to allow the passage of the ladder. The captain figured out that he was standing level with the floor of the basement and that the space above the opening at the top of the little room was the space under the stairway. There was a door in the outside wall, next to the ladder. "What's down there?" asked Sawa from above. Just a little place with a door in it, replied the captain, retracing his steps up the ladder. The passage isn't inside the house at all, he reported when he reached the top. It's outside. There's a door down there that probably opens into it. I'm going to get my coat and see where the passage leads to. We'll all go with you, said Sawa, and it was she who went down the ladder first when the expedition started. The captain came next, carrying a lantern he had found in the kitchen. At the bottom of the ladder he lit the lantern. The first thing its light fell upon was a broken glass jar, lying in a corner, and from it there extended across the floor a bright red stream. Sawa recoiled when she saw it, but the captain stooped over and streaked his finger through it. Paint, he exclaimed. Red paint, said Sawa. It looked just like blood. Why, that's what must have made the footprints on the stairs. The man must have stepped in this paint. He came in through this passage. The other three had come down by that time, and they all looked at each other in dumb astonishment. How clear it all was now. The footprints beginning under the stair landing, the mystery connected with the entrance of the intruder, they all fitted together perfectly. The paint's still sticky, said the captain, examining his finger, which had a bright red daub on the end. It must have been spilled there quite recently. The burglar must have spilled it himself, said Katherine. But how on earth would a burglar know about this secret entrance, marveled Sawa. The others were not prepared to answer. Maybe Hercules told somebody, said Justice. But Hercules doesn't seem to know about it himself, said Katherine. He says he doesn't, but I'll bet he does, just the same, said Justice. Hercules wouldn't tell any burglar about this way of getting into the house. Sawa defended stoutly. His as TNLE as steel. If anybody told the burglar, it was somebody beside Hercules. Maybe the burglar discovered the other end of the passage himself, by accident, just as we did this end, said Slim. Come on, said the captain impatiently, let's go and see where that other end is. Wait a minute, what's this, said Justice, spying a long rope of twisted copper wire hanging down close beside the ladder. This rope came through the opening above them, that was as far as their eyes could follow it. Its beginning was somewhere up in the space under the stairs. Pull it and see what happens, said Slim. I'll bet it works the slide opening from below here, said Justice. He gave it a vigorous pull and they heard the same click that had followed the twisting of the stair post. In a moment the light that had come down through the opening vanished, and they knew that the landing had gone back into position. Another pull at the rope and it opened up again. Pretty slick, commented Justice. It works two ways, both coming and going. A fellow on the inside could get out, and a fellow on the outside could get in, without the people in the house knowing anything about it. Are you coming now? Asked the captain. I'm going to start. He opened the door in the outer wall as he spoke. It swung inward, crowding them in the narrow space in which they stood. A rush of cold air greeted them. The captain held the lantern in front of him and peered out into the darkness. There are some steps down, he said. He stepped over the threshold and led the way. 6 steps down brought them to the floor of a rock-lined passage, a natural tunnel through the hill. Carver Hill must be a regular stone quarry, said Justice. All the cellar walls of Carver House are made of slabs of stone like this, and so is the foundation. There are big stones cropping out all over the hill, said the captain. It's a regular granite monument. What a jolly tunnel this is. And what a gorgeous way of escape, remarked Justice admiringly. But what need would there be of an underground way of escape? Asked Katherine wonderingly. What were the people escaping from? This house was built in the days of the colonies, replied Justice sagely, and the Carvers were patriots. That probably put them in a pretty tight position once in a while. No doubt they concealed American soldiers in their home at times. This passage was probably built as a means of entrance and escape when things got too hot up above. British troops may have been quartered in the house, or watching the outside. What a peach of a way this was to evade them, he exclaimed in a burst of admiration. I wish I'd lived in those times, he went on, with envy in his tone. They didn't keep fellows out of the army on account of their throats then. What fun a soldier must have had, getting in and out of this house, right under the nose of the British. Suppose they suspected he was in the house and came in to search for him? He'd just turn the post on the stairs, and click. The landing would slide open and down the ladder he'd go and out through this passage. The enemy would never discover where he went in a million years. Come on, let's see where this passage comes out, urged the captain, and started ahead with the lantern. The passage sloped steeply downward, with frequent turns and twists. We're going down the hill, said the captain. Whoever heard of going down the inside of a hill, said Sawa. It's like going through that passage under Niagara Falls, said Slim, only it's not quite so wet. After another sharp turn and a steep drop, they came out in a good-sized chamber whose walls, floor and ceiling were all of rock. It's a cave, shouted the captain, and his voice echoed and re-echoed weirdly, until the place seemed to be filled with dozens of voices. A cold draught played upon them from somewhere, and, although they all had on sweaters and caps, they shivered in the chilly atmosphere. There was no glimmer of light anywhere to indicate an opening to the outside. The light of the lantern fell upon a wooden bench and a rough table, both painted bright red. On the table stood 2 tall bottles, thickly covered with dust, and between them was a grinning human skull with 2 crossbones behind it. Katherine and Sawa involuntarily jumped and shrieked when they saw it. Somebody died down here, gasped Sawa. Nonsense, said Justice. It was Uncle Jasper playing pirate. See, there's his chest over there.